Hello everyone and welcome back to the creepy story. Now I know a lot of you use these videos to sleep, so before you drift off I thought it would be a fun idea if everyone can leave a comment to let me know you are listening from in the world. Also like, and let's get comfy and relaxed and let's get enjoying the subscribe it's begin. I was driving home late one night after working a double shift at the diner. The roads were nearly empty, just the occasional car passing by. It was one of those nights where everything feels too quiet, like the world is holding its breath. I wasn't thinking about much, just trying to keep my eyes on the road and not drift off from exhaustion. The city lights were fading as I got closer to my neighborhood. I stopped at a red light on the intersection of Willow and Main. There wasn't a single car coming in any direction, but I waited because the law is the law, and I wasn't in the mood to risk a ticket. My windows were rolled up, and the soft hum of my car engine was the only sound. I stared ahead, half dazed from the long day. That's when I noticed the car. It was a dark sedan, older but not too beat up. It had pulled up behind me at the light, which wouldn't have been unusual except it wasn't there when I first stopped. I didn't hear it approach. I thought maybe I was just too zoned out to notice, but something about it made me uneasy. It didn't have its headlights on. I adjusted my rearview mirror to get a better look, and I could see the outline of someone in the driver's seat. They were sitting completely still, like they were waiting for something. I told myself not to overthink it. It was probably just some tired person, like me, heading home after a long day. I shifted in my seat, my fingers tapping the steering wheel, and kept my eyes on the red light, willing it to change. But then I saw movement. The driver's side door of the car behind me opened, and a man stepped out. He wasn't in a rush. His movements were slow and deliberate, like he had all the time in the world. He was tall, wearing dark clothes, and I couldn't see his face clearly under the dim glow of the streetlights. My stomach dropped. I locked my car doors instinctively. The sound of the locks clicking felt deafening in the silence, and for a second, I thought he might have heard it. He started walking toward my car, hands in his pockets. I couldn't think. My brain felt stuck, like it was short-circuiting. I told myself maybe he needed help, maybe his car broke down and he was just coming to ask for directions or to borrow a phone. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. There was something wrong about the way he moved, too calm, too sure of himself. He stopped at my driver's side window. I tried not to look at him, but I couldn't help it. My eyes darted toward him, and I caught a glimpse of his face. He was grinning. It wasn't a friendly grin, though. It was too wide, too forced, like he was trying to mimic an expression he didn't quite understand. He raised a hand and tapped on the glass with one knuckle. It was a soft sound, but it made my whole body tense up. I shook my head, hoping he'd take the hint and leave. But he didn't. He leaned down so his face was closer to the window, his grin never faltering. Then, without warning, he reached for the door handle. My heart was racing now, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. The door didn't budge, it was locked, but he kept pulling at the handle, jiggling it like he thought it might suddenly open if he tried hard enough. He didn't say a word. I thought about rolling down the window just enough to tell him to go away, but something told me not to. I didn't want to engage with him, didn't want to give him any reason to think I was willing to interact. The light was still red. It felt like it had been stuck that way forever. I glanced at the other lanes, desperate to see another car, another person, anything, but the streets were empty. He started knocking harder now, his grin twisting into something almost mocking. It was like he was enjoying the fact I wasn't reacting. I could feel tears welling up in my eyes, but I blinked them away. I couldn't lose it, not now. Then he did something that made my blood run cold. He pulled something out of his pocket, a small object I couldn't quite make out at first. It was shiny, catching the faint light from the street lamp. He held it up to the window, tapping it against the glass. It was a knife. My whole body went numb. I didn't think. I just acted. I slammed my foot on the gas pedal, wanting the red light. My tires screeched against the pavement as my car lurched forward. For a split second, I thought I might lose control, but I managed to straighten the wheel and keep going. In my rearview mirror, I saw him standing in the middle of a road, watching me drive away. His car was still parked at the light, but he didn't make any move to get back into it. He just stood there, holding the knife at his side, his grin still plastered on his face. I didn't stop driving until I was home. Even when I pulled into my driveway and locked my car doors, I couldn't shake the feeling that he might have followed me. I sat in the car for a long time, scanning the street for any sign of him or his car. When I finally worked up the courage to go inside, I locked every door and window in the house. That night, I barely slept. Every sound made me jump, every shadow looked like him standing outside. I kept checking my phone, half expecting to see a message from an unknown number or hear a knock at the door. But nothing happened. I reported the incident to the police the next day, but without a license plate number or any real description of the man, there wasn't much they could do. They told me to be careful and to call them if anything else happened. It's been weeks now, and I haven't seen him again. But every time I stop at a red light, I catch myself glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see that dark sedan pull up behind me. I don't know who he was or what he wanted, and I hope I never find out. It was supposed to be a quick overnight stay. I was driving cross-country for work, and I didn't want to spend much, so I booked a cheap motel just off the highway. It wasn't much to look at: peeling paint on the walls, a neon sign that flickered, and a parking lot that felt too empty for how many cars were actually there. But it was late, and I was tired. I just wanted a bed and a lock on the door. The check-in process was quick. The guy at the desk barely looked up from his phone while he handed me the key, an actual metal key with the room number engraved on a tag. Room 108. I remember it because I muttered it to myself while I walked down the hall, trying to remember where I was going. The room was what you'd expect. A bed with an ugly floral comforter, a TV that buzzed when it was on, and a faint smell of bleach mixed with something damp. I didn't care. I threw my bag on the chair, locked the door, and double-checked the bolt and chain before getting ready for bed. I don't know what time it was when I woke up, but it was still dark outside. Something had pulled me out of sleep, a sound, faint but distinct. At first, I thought it might be from the room next door. The walls were thin, and I heard muffled voices earlier when we checked in. But as I lay there, holding my breath, I realized it wasn't coming from the wall. It was coming from the door. It sounded like someone trying to turn the handle, slow and deliberate. The sound was faint, but in the silence of the room, it was deafening. I froze, my eyes locked on the shadowy outline of the door. The chain was still on, and I had locked it, hadn't I? I was sure I had. The noise stopped for a moment, and I let myself exhale. Maybe it was a mistake. Maybe someone had the wrong room. But then it started again, this time louder. The handle rattled, more forceful now, like whoever was out there was testing to see if the lock would give. My heart was racing. I slid out of bed as quietly as I could, grabbing my phone from the nightstand. I dialed the front desk, keeping my eyes on the door the whole time. The phone rang twice before the same guy who checked me in answered. He sounded half asleep. "Front desk," he mumbled. "There's someone trying to get into my room," I whispered, my voice barely audible even to myself. "What room?" 108. There was a pause. I heard paper shuffling on his end, and then he said, "No one's been sent to your room." My stomach dropped. "I'm telling you, someone's at my door. They're trying to open it." Another pause, this one longer. "I'll check the cameras," he said finally, and then the line went dead. I stood there, phone still pressed to my ear, listening to the empty dial tone. The rattling had stopped again, but I didn't feel any relief. I crept closer to the door, my bare feet making no sound on the thin carpet. I wanted to look through the peephole, but the thought of getting that close to the door made my skin crawl. Instead, I stayed to the side, straining to hear anything, footsteps, breathing, anything to tell me if whoever it was had left. Then I heard it. A light tap, tap, tap against the door. Not a knock. More like fingers drumming on the wood, slow and steady. I backed away, my hand shaking so badly I nearly dropped my phone. I wanted to call the front desk again, but what was the point? They said no one was sent to my room. If it wasn't staff, then who the hell was it? The tapping stopped, and for a moment, everything was quiet. Then I heard the sound of something brushing against the door, like fabric sliding over the surface. It was so faint I almost thought I was imagining it, but it was there. I was about to call the police when the doorknob rattled again, harder this time. The chain rattled against a frame, and I could see the handle jerk slightly, like someone was trying to force it open. I couldn't take it anymore. "Who's there?" I yelled, my voice cracking. The rattling stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating. Then, in a low, almost amused voice, someone said, "Open the door." It wasn't a request. It wasn't even a demand. It was something worse, something that sent chills down my spine. I backed away until I hit the bed, my knees buckling. My mind was racing, trying to figure out what to do. The chain would hold, wouldn't it? It had to. I grabbed the chair from the corner of the room and shoved it under the doorknob. It wasn't much, but it made me feel a little safer. I stayed up the rest of the night, sitting on the bed with my phone in my hand, waiting for the first sign of daylight. The person didn't come back, and eventually, the sound stopped altogether. When the sun finally rose, I packed my bag and left without even taking a shower. I didn't bother checking out. I just wanted to get out of there. I don't know who it was or what they wanted. The guy at the front desk didn't seem surprised when I told him someone had tried to get into my room. He just shrugged and said, "I didn't see anything on the cameras." I didn't believe him. I still don't. I had just finished dinner with some friends and didn't feel like walking back to my apartment alone that late at night. It wasn't far, but the streets were dark, and I didn't want to risk it. So, I ordered an Uber. I'd done it 100 times before, so I didn't think twice about it. The car pulled up a couple of minutes later. It was a dark sedan, just like the app said, with the right license plate. The driver was an older man, maybe in his late 40s or early 50s. He looked normal, clean-cut, wearing a baseball cap. He smiled as I got in. "Jessica?" he asked, glancing at his phone. "Yes," I said, settling into the back seat. The ride started out fine. He didn't talk much, which I preferred, and I just stared at my phone, scrolling through messages. After a couple of minutes, though, I noticed we weren't heading in the direction I expected. The streets didn't look familiar, and the route on the app wasn't matching where we were going. I think you missed a turn," I said, leaning forward a little. He didn't answer right away. He just kept driving, his hands tight on the wheel. "Sometimes the app doesn't know the best way," he said finally. His voice was calm, almost too calm. "I know a shortcut. It'll get you home faster." Something about the way he said it made my stomach tighten. "But that's not the route the app is showing," I said. He glanced at me in the rearview mirror, his eyes dark under the brim of his cap. "Trust me. This way's safer." I tried to stay calm, but my heart was racing. "I prefer if you just followed the route on the app," I said, my voice shaking a little. He didn't respond. Instead, he reached down and pressed the button to lock the doors. The sound of the locks clicking into place made my blood run cold. "What are you doing?" I asked, my voice rising. He didn't answer. His grip on the wheel tightened, and he kept driving, turning onto a smaller, darker street. "Let me out," I said, my hand fumbling for the door handle. It didn't budge. The child lock was on. "You don't understand," he said, his voice still eerily calm. "This neighborhood isn't safe at night. I'm taking you somewhere better." I was panicking now, my breath coming in short gasps. "I'm calling the police," I said, grabbing my phone. He laughed, a low, quiet sound that sent a shiver down my spine. "Go ahead," he said. "By the time they find you, you'll thank me for keeping you safe." I dialed 911, but my hands were shaking so badly I could barely hit the buttons. The operator picked up, and I blurted out that I was in an Uber and the driver wasn't taking me where I was supposed to go. I gave them the car's license plate and described where we were as best as I could. The driver noticed. He glanced at me again in the mirror, and his calm demeanor cracked for the first time. "You shouldn't have done that," he said, his voice colder now. He sped up, taking another sharp turn onto an even darker road. There were no streetlights, no houses, just trees on either side of the road. I felt trapped, completely helpless. I kept the line open with the operator, whispering updates about where we were going. She told me to stay calm, that officers were on their way, but it didn't feel real. It felt like I was already too far gone. The driver pulled over suddenly, slamming on the brakes. He turned around in his seat to look at me, his face shadowed by the dim interior light. "Get out," he said, his voice low and threatening. I froze. "What?" "You want out so bad," he said, unlocking the doors. "Then get out." I didn't move. I didn't trust him. We were in the middle of nowhere, and I had no idea where I was. "Go," he shouted, his voice sharp now. I grabbed my bag and slid out of the car, keeping my phone clutched to my hand. As soon as I was out, he sped off, the tires kicking up gravel as he disappeared down the road. I stood there, shaking, trying to catch my breath. I could hear the operator's voice still coming from my phone, asking if I was okay, but I couldn't answer. I was too scared to speak. Eventually, a police car found me. I gave them a statement, told them everything that happened, but they didn't seem optimistic about catching the guy. They said the app information might help, but sometimes drivers use fake profiles or stolen cars. I don't know who he was or what he planned to do, but I haven't taken a rideshare since. I had been driving for hours. It was dark, and the highway felt endless. The gas station coffee I'd picked up earlier wasn't doing its job, and my eyes were heavy. I decided to pull off at the next rest area to stretch my legs and wake up a bit before continuing home. The parking lot was mostly empty, just a couple of trucks parked on the far side, their engines rumbling softly. I parked close to the building, under one of the dim lights. As I got out of the car, The cold air hit me, and I pulled my jacket tighter around myself. The place looked old, the kind of rest stop you only see on back highways, cracked pavement, flickering lights, and a vending machine with half the buttons taped over. Inside, it was quiet. Too quiet. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly, and the air smelled faintly of cleaning supplies. There was a small bulletin board by the door with faded flyers pinned to it, but otherwise, the place was bare. I glanced at the bathrooms, hesitating for a moment. The women's restroom door was slightly ajar, and the light inside flickered. I told myself it was fine. I just needed to go quickly and get back on the road. The bathroom was small, with 3 stalls and a single sink. I chose the stall furthest from the door, locking it behind me. As I sat there, I noticed how quiet it was. There was no music, no hum of traffic from outside, just silence, broken only by the occasional creak of the pipes. I was about to stand up and leave when I heard it, a faint shuffling noise, like someone moving outside the bathroom. I froze, straining to hear. The footsteps stopped, and then there was a soft creak, like the bathroom door being pushed open. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing slightly. No response. I waited a few seconds, my heart starting to race. Maybe it was just someone else coming in. Maybe I was overthinking. I flushed the toilet, unlocking the stall door. As I stepped out, I caught sight of something through the small gap between the door and the frame. A shadow moved across the light. "Is someone there?" I asked, my voice louder now. Still nothing. I took a few cautious steps toward the sink, my eyes flicking to the door every couple of seconds. I felt exposed, vulnerable. The flickering light above me made the shadow shift and stretch in strange ways. As I reached for the faucet to wash my hands, I heard it, the unmistakable sound of something heavy being pressed against the outside of the bathroom door. It was quick, like someone sliding a weight into place. Panic hit me like a wave. I rushed to the door, grabbing the handle and pulling. It didn't budge. "Hey!" I yelled, banging on the door. "Let me out." No answer. I pounded harder, my fists stinging against the cold metal. "Is someone out there?" "This isn't funny." The footsteps came again, slow and deliberate. They moved past the door and then stopped. I pressed my ear against the cold surface, trying to listen. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice cracking. Nothing. I stepped back, my mind racing. I looked around the small bathroom, my eyes landing on the tiny window above the far stall. It was small, barely bigger than a shoebox, but maybe I could fit through it. I climbed onto the toilet, pushing the window open. Cold air rushed in, and I realized how high up the bathroom was. The crown outside was at least 8 feet down, maybe more. My heart sank. Behind me, I heard a noise that made my blood run cold, a faint scraping sound, like something being dragged across the floor just outside the door. I froze, not daring to move. My breath came in shallow gasps as I stared at the door, waiting for something, anything. The scraping stopped, and for a moment, everything was silent again. Then, a single knock. It was soft, almost polite, but it sent a chill down my spine. "Who are you?" I screamed. "What do you want?" There was no reply, just the sound of the door creaking slightly as if someone was pressing against it from the other side. I climbed down from the toilet, grabbing my phone from my pocket. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely unlock it. I dialed 911, pressing the phone to my ear. 911, what's your emergency? I'm trapped in a restroom at a highway rest stop, I said, my voice shaky. Someone's outside, and they won't let me out. The operator started asking me questions, but I could barely focus on her words. I kept my eyes on the door, expecting it to burst open at any second. "I've dispatched officers to your location," she said. "Stay on the line." I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. "Okay," I whispered. The footsteps started again, moving away from the door. I could hear them fading into the distance. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. A few minutes later, I heard the faint wail of sirens. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. The footsteps returned, faster this time, and I heard the heavy object being dragged away from the door. I backed into the corner of the bathroom, clutching my phone like it was a lifeline. The door creaked open slowly, and I braced myself. But it wasn't the police. It was a man, dressed in dark clothes, his face partially hidden by a hood. He didn't say anything, just stood there, staring at me. The sound of the sirens grew louder, and the man's head snapped toward the direction they were coming from. Without a word, he turned and ran. Moments later, 2 officers burst into the restroom, their flashlights cutting through the dim light. I broke down, sobbing as I tried to explain what had happened. They searched the area but didn't find him. They told me he was probably long gone. I don't know what he wanted or what would have happened if the police hadn't arrived. But I've never stopped at a rest area since. I've lost my keys about a month ago. I didn't think much of it at the time. I figured I must have dropped them somewhere in the rush of running errands. After tearing apart my car, my apartment, and retracing my steps twice, I gave up and called the locksmith. I was annoyed at myself for losing them, but it didn't feel like a big deal. The guy came the next day. He looked normal, mid-40s, tall, a bit heavy-set. He had one of those trucks with the company name and number printed on the side. He seemed friendly, chatting a bit as he worked. I wasn't in the mood for small talk, but I didn't want to be rude. He told me he'd been doing this for years, and I nodded, pretending to care. I just wanted the lock fixed. It didn't take him long. He rekeyed the lock, handed me 2 shiny new keys, and said I'd be good to go. Before he left, he gave me this awkward smile and said something about how I should always call professional. I didn't think anything of it at the time, but looking back, it feels different now. A week went by, and I didn't give the locksmith another thought. Life was normal. Work, errands, sitting on my couch at night watching TV. Then, one night, something happened that I can't explain away. I'd fallen asleep on the couch with the TV still on. It was around midnight when I woke up, groggy and disoriented. I reached for the remote to turn off the TV when I noticed something. The hallway light was on. I always turn off the hallway light before bed. Always. My stomach dropped, but I told myself I must have forgotten. I got up to turn it off and head to my bedroom when I froze. There were faint footprints on the hardwood floor, marked by the rain outside. Someone had been inside. My first thought was that I'd forgotten to lock the door, but when I checked, the deadbolt was turned. It was locked. I grabbed my phone and called the police. My voice was shaking as I explained what I'd found. They sent someone out, but by the time they arrived, there was nothing to find. The officer checked the lock, walked around my house, and said there wasn't much they could do. There were no signs of forced entry, and nothing had been stolen. I felt stupid, like I'd overreacted. But I didn't sleep that night. I sat in bed, staring at the door, every creak of the house making me jump. The next night, I tried to convince myself I'd imagined it. Maybe the footprints had been mine. Maybe I'd forgotten to turn off the hallway light. I was overthinking. That's what I told myself. But then, a week later, it happened. It was late again, probably close to 1 in the morning. I was in bed, scrolling on my phone, trying to fall asleep. That's when I heard it, a creak in the living room. I froze, my heart racing. I told myself it was just I'll settling, but then I heard another sound. A soft, deliberate sound, like someone trying to move quietly. I didn't have a weapon. I didn't even have anything nearby to use as one. I grabbed my phone and slid out of bed, my hands trembling so badly I could barely hold it. I stepped into the hallway, every shadow suddenly looking long, every sound amplified. When I got to the living room, I stopped dead in my tracks. The locksmith was standing in the middle of my living room. He was holding a flashlight, but it wasn't on. He didn't look surprised to see me. In fact, he smiled, like he was happy I caught him. I wanted to make sure the lock was working, he said, his voice calm, like this was completely normal. My mind couldn't process it. He was here, in my house, in the middle of the night. He'd used the lock he'd reteed. Get out, I said, my voice shaky. He tilted his head, like he didn't understand why I was upset. You seemed worried when I was here last time. I thought I'd check in. Make sure everything's secure. I backed away toward the kitchen, my hand fumbling for the knife block on the counter. I'm calling the police, I said. He didn't move. He just stood there, watching me, the smile fading slightly. You don't need to do that, he said, his tone almost annoyed. I didn't respond. I grabbed the largest knife I could find and held it out in front of me. Leave, I said again, louder this time. He raised his hands slightly, like he was surrendering. All right, he said. No need to get worked up. He walked to the door, moving slowly, like he wasn't in any kind of rush. Before he left, he turned back to me. You should really be more careful about who you let into your home, he said. Then he walked out, closing the door behind him. As soon as he was gone, I locked the door, grabbed my phone, and called the police again. This time, they took me seriously. They found him a few hours later, parked a few blocks away in his truck. Inside the truck, they found a collection of keys. Not just to my house, but to dozens of others. I don't know how many people he'd done this to or what his plan was. The police told me I was lucky, but I don't feel lucky. I can't stop thinking about how long he might have been watching me, how many nights he'd been inside without me knowing. I got the locks changed again, this time by some I picked after hours of research. I haven't slept well since. Every noise makes my heart race, every shadow feels like it's hiding someone. I don't think I'll ever feel safe in my own home again. I went to the store that day like I always did after work. It wasn't anything special, just my usual groceries, some bread, milk, a few vegetables, and coffee. The kind of routine trip you don't think twice about. I wasn't in a rush, so I went to a regular checkout line instead of the self-checkout. The cashier was young, maybe in his early 20s, and he had this overly friendly demeanor. At first, I didn't think much of it. He greeted me and started scanning my items. Then he noticed the coffee I picked out and said, "Oh, this is a good one. I drink it all the time. You'll love it." I nodded, just being polite. As he scanned the rest of my items, he kept talking. "Trying to eat healthy, huh?" he said, looking at the vegetables. I just smiled awkwardly. Then he said, "I always tell myself I'll start eating better, but it never sticks. You seem like you've got it figured out, though." It was strange, but now aren't we? Some cashiers like to make conversation, and I didn't want to be rude. I just said something like, "I try," and hoped he'd move on. But he didn't. "Do you live around here?" he asked, looking up from the register. That question made me pause. I didn't want to answer, so I said something vague, like, "Not too far." He smiled, nodded, and handed me my receipt. "Well, maybe I'll see you around," he said. I left the store feeling a little unsettled, but I told myself I was overthinking it. He was probably just overly chatty, trying to pass the time at work. I tried to shake it off. When I got home, I unpacked my groceries and settled in for the evening. It was a quiet night, just me and my book. I wasn't expecting anyone, so when I noticed headlights through my window, I immediately felt on edge. I live in a quiet neighborhood, and cars don't usually just park outside unless they're visiting someone. I went to the window and peeked through the blinds. It was him. The cashier from the store was sitting in his car, parked across the street from my house. At first, I couldn't believe it. I thought maybe I was mistaken, but then I saw him turn his head slightly, looking toward my house. It was him. I stepped back from the window, my heart racing. I didn't know what to do. Should I call someone? Should I confront him? Part of me thought I was imagining things, that there was no way this was happening. But the longer I stood there, the more real it became. I decided to wait it out, to see if he would leave. But he didn't. He just sat there, not moving. After about 15 minutes, I grabbed my phone and called a friend. I didn't want to call the police yet. I wasn't sure if I was overreacting, but I needed to talk to someone. I told her what was happening, and she told me to stay inside, lock the doors, and keep an eye on him. So that's what I did. Another 20 minutes passed, and he still didn't leave. He wasn't doing anything, just sitting in his car, staring at my house. It was the kind of stillness that made my skin crawl. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I decided to call the police. When I explained the situation, the dispatcher took me seriously. They said they'd send an officer to check it out, but it might take some time. I stayed on the phone with them, watching through the blinds, waiting for him to move. That's when his car door opened. I froze. He stepped out, looked around, and started walking toward my house. I whispered into the phone, telling the dispatcher what was happening. She told me to stay calm, to lock myself in a room if I felt unsafe. I backed away from the window and locked the front door, double-checking it. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely turn the lock. I heard footsteps outside, slow and deliberate, like he was taking his time. Then there was a knock on the door. It wasn't loud or aggressive. It was calm, almost polite. "Hello," he called out. I didn't answer. "I just wanted to make sure you got home okay," he said. His voice was muffled through the door but still clear enough to make my stomach turn. I stayed silent, clutching my phone like it was the only thing keeping me safe. "I saw you leave the store and thought you might need help carrying your groceries," he said. "Help?" At nearly 10 p.m., the dispatcher told me the police were on their way, that I just needed to stay quiet and wait. He knocked again, harder this time. "I know you're in there," he said. His tone was different now, less friendly. "I saw you through the window." I wanted to scream, but I didn't. I bit my lips so hard it hurt, trying to keep myself from making a sound. Then he jiggled the doorknob. That was why I lost it. I screamed at him to leave, yelling that the police were on their way. For a moment, everything went quiet. And then I heard him laugh. It wasn't loud, just a slow, unsettling chuckle. "All right," he said. "I'll see you around." I heard his footsteps retreat, and when I peeked out the window again, I saw him getting back into his car. He drove off just as the police arrived. I gave the officers his description and told them everything that happened. They said they'd look into it, but I could tell they didn't think much would come of it. I haven't seen him since, but every time I go to that store, I look for him. I can't help it. I don't even know if he still works there, and part of me doesn't want to find out. I keep my doors locked all the time now, even during the day. I double-check the windows every night before bed. It's been weeks, but I still feel like he's out there, watching, waiting. I don't think I'll ever feel safe again. I was waiting for the bus at the stop near my apartment. It was getting late, and the streetlights had just come on. There were a few other people around, but they were scattered, nobody close enough for me to feel like I wasn't alone. The bus schedule said it was running late, so I figured I'd be standing there for a while. I had my headphones in, trying to kill time, but I wasn't playing anything too loud. I like to stay aware, especially at night. After a few minutes, I noticed a car pull up across the street. It wasn't parked, exactly, it just kind of stopped there, idling with the lights on. I didn't think much of it at first. But then the driver rolled down their window and leaned out. It was a man, probably in his late 40s, maybe early 50s. He waved at me, which immediately felt off. I wasn't sure if he was trying to get my attention or someone else's, but when I glanced around, it was clear I was the only one he was looking at. I took out one of my earbuds, and he called out, "Hey, you need a ride?" I shook my head and said, "No, I'm good. Thanks." He stayed there for a second, like he was thinking about what to say next. Then he pulled his car forward, crossing the street to get closer. He stopped right in front of a bus stop and rolled the passenger window down. "You sure? It's not safe to be out here this late," he said. His tone wasn't threatening, but something about the way he was looking at me made my skin crawl. He had this overly familiar smile, like we knew each other, even though I was sure I'd never seen him before. "I'm fine. The bus will be here soon," I said, trying to sound polite but firm. He nodded slowly, like he was considering my answer. "You don't look like you should be standing out here by yourself. Where are you headed?" "I'm not in a hurry. I can take you wherever you need to go." At that point, I wasn't even trying to hide my discomfort. I took a step back from the curb and said, "I'm fine. Please leave me alone." His smile didn't falter, but there was something behind his eyes now, something calculating. "I'm just trying to help," he said. He didn't leave, though. He stayed parked there, his engine still running, watching me. I turned away and pretended to check my phone, hoping he'd get the hint. But he didn't. Instead, I heard his car door open. I glanced over and saw him getting out. He wasn't rushing or anything, just moving like he had all the time in the world. He was tall, maybe 6 feet, with a thin frame, but his movements were deliberate, like he wasn't afraid of anyone. "You don't have to be scared," he said, walking toward me. "I'm a nice guy. Just thought you could use a little kindness." I stepped further back, putting more distance between us. My heart was pounding, and I was trying to think of what to do. There were still a couple of other people at the stop, but they were too far to notice what was happening, and none of them seemed to care. "I don't need your help," I said, louder this time. He stopped a few feet away from me, tilting his head like he was confused. "Why are you being so rude?" "I'm just trying to make sure you're safe." I didn't respond. I was trying to figure out if I should walk away or stay where I was. The bus couldn't be more than a few minutes out, but every second felt like an hour. He must have noticed my hesitation because he stepped closer. "You know, some people will be grateful for a ride," he said. His voice was lower now, almost like he was scolding me. That's when I decided to leave. I grabbed my bag and started walking down the sidewalk, away from the bus stop. I didn't care if I missed the bus, I just needed to put some distance between us. But he followed me. "Hey, where are you going?" he called after me. I didn't answer. I kept walking, my pace quickening, if I could hear his footsteps behind me. He wasn't running, just keeping a steady pace, like he wasn't in a hurry. "Come on," he said. "I'm not a bad guy. You're making this harder than it needs to be." I turned a corner, hoping to lose him, but when I looked back, he was still there. His smile was gone now, replaced with something colder. I reached for my phone, dialing 911 as I walked. When the operator picked up, I whispered that someone was following me. They asked for my location, and I tried to explain while keeping an eye on the man. He must have realized what I was doing because he stopped walking. "Really?" he said, almost laughing. "You're calling the cops on me? For what?" "Trying to help." I didn't answer. I just kept walking, the operator on the line telling me to stay on the phone and keep moving. The man stood there for a moment, watching me. Then he turned and walked back toward his car. I thought he was leaving, but instead, he got in and started driving slowly down the street, keeping pace with me. The operator told me to stay visible and head toward a walled area. I spotted a gas station up ahead and made my way there as quickly as I could. The man's car followed me the whole way, his headlights cutting through the dark like a spotlight. When I reached the gas station, I went inside and told the clerk what was happening. He looked outside and saw the car parked near the entrance. The man wasn't getting out, he was just sitting there, waiting. The police arrived a few minutes later. When they pulled up, the man drove off. The officers tried to follow him, but I don't know if they caught him. I gave them a description and told them everything that happened. They told me I did the right thing by calling and said they'd keep an eye out for him. I haven't seen him since, but every time I'm out at night, I can't help but look over my shoulder, half expecting to see that car again. It's a feeling I can't shake, like he's still out there somewhere, waiting for another chance. It was around 7 p.m., and I just finished dinner. I was sitting in the living room, flipping through channels, when there was a knock at the door. It startled me because I wasn't expecting anyone, and I don't usually get visitors at that time. I got up, looked through the peephole, and saw a man standing there in what looked like a utility uniform. He was wearing a blue shirt with some company logo on it, though I couldn't make out the name from the tiny lettering. He had a clipboard in one hand and a small tool bag in the other. I didn't open the door right away. Something felt off. But he knocked again, more firmly this time. "Who is it?" I asked through the door. "Hi, sir. I'm here to check your Wi-Fi," he said. His tone was polite, professional even, but it was strange because I hadn't called for any service. "I didn't request anything," I said. "Oh, it's a routine check," he replied quickly, like he'd been prepared for that answer. "We've had some outages reported in the area, and we're going door to door to make sure everyone's connection is stable." That didn't make sense to me. My Wi-Fi had been working fine all day, and I hadn't seen or heard anything about outages. I told him as much. "Well, sometimes the issues don't show up right away," he said. "It's better to catch them early. It'll only take a minute. I just need to take a look at your router." I still didn't open the door. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. His explanation sounded rehearsed, like he'd said it 100 times before. "Do you have ID?" I asked. There was a pause, and then he said, "Sure, 1 second." He fumbled with his clipboard, pulling out what looked like a badge. He held it up to the peephole, but it was hard to read. The logo on the badge didn't even match the one on his shirt. "I'm sorry," I said, "but I'm not comfortable letting you in. If there's an issue, I'll call the provider myself." There was another pause. When he spoke again, his tone was a little less friendly. "I understand, but this is a time-sensitive matter. If you don't let me check now, you could lose service later tonight." I felt my stomach tighten. He was starting to sound pushy, and the whole situation was setting off alarms in my head. "No, thanks," I said firmly. "I'll take my chances." He didn't respond right away. I watched through the peephole as he shifted his weight, glancing down the hallway. Then he leaned closer to the door, lowering his voice. "Look, I'm just trying to help," he said. "Why are you being so difficult? Most people would appreciate me coming out here this late." That was it for me. I told him I was calling the company to verify his story and stepped away from the door. I didn't actually call the provider, I dialed 911 instead. As I was on the phone with the dispatcher, I kept an eye on the peephole. The man was still standing there, but he wasn't knocking anymore. He was just waiting. The dispatcher asked for details, and I described the situation as best I could. While I was talking, the man suddenly knocked again, louder this time. "Sir, I need to know your schedule," he said, his voice losing all pretense of professionalism. "What time do you usually leave for work? Are you home during the day?" I froze. My blood went cold when he said that. He wasn't here for the Wi-Fi, he was trying to figure out when the apartment will be empty. I didn't respond. I stayed completely silent, hoping he'd think I'd left or wasn't listening anymore. After a few minutes, I heard him sigh. "All right, fine," he said, almost casually. "We'll do this another time." I heard his footsteps retreating down the hallway, and I stayed by the door, listening. A moment later, I peeked through the peephole again and saw him walking away, but he wasn't heading toward the stairs or the elevator. He stopped at one of the other doors down the hall and knocked. I told the dispatcher what I saw, and they said officers were on their way. I stayed on the line until I heard them arrive. They knocked on my door and identified themselves before I let them in. I explained everything that had happened, and they went to check the hallway. The man was gone by then, but the officers said they'd patrol the area and keep an eye out for him. They asked if I wanted to file a report, and I did. I gave them the best description I could: mid-40s, average build, wearing a fake utility uniform. They told me it was a good thing I didn't open the door, and that people like him often use similar tactics to case homes for break-ins. I couldn't sleep that night. Every sound made me jump, and I kept checking the peephole, half expecting him to come back. It's been a few weeks now, and nothing else has happened, but I still get nervous every time someone knocks on my door. I always check the peephole and ask questions, and I never let anyone in unless I'm absolutely sure who they are. I don't know what that guy was planning, but I'm glad I trusted my instincts. I don't think he was just looking to fix my Wi-Fi. While I moved into my new apartment, I was excited to finally have a place to myself. It wasn't fancy or anything, just a one-bedroom on the second floor of an older building, but it was mine. The first week was spent unpacking, arranging furniture, and settling into the new routine. Everything seemed fine, even though the building itself was a little outdated. The landlord, Mr. Davis, was this older guy who seemed friendly enough. He told me to let him know if I needed anything. A few days in, I started noticing something strange. At night, when I turned off my bedroom lights, there was this faint, blinking red light coming from the smoke detector on the ceiling. I hadn't noticed it before. During the day, it didn't blink, but at night it was consistent every couple of seconds, just a small red flash. At first, I thought it was normal. Maybe it was just a signal that the battery was low or something. I'd seen smoke detectors with blinking lights before, but this one didn't make any noise, no beeping or chirping. It was just the light. After a couple of nights, it started to bother me. I couldn't stop staring at it while I was lying in bed. It felt like it was watching me. I know that sounds crazy, but it was such an odd feeling. I even tried putting tape over it one night, but the light still managed to peek through the edges, like it was stubborn. By the weekend, I decided to take a closer look. I grabbed a chair from the kitchen and stood on it to get closer to the smoke detector. I noticed right away that it didn't look like a normal one. It was slightly bulkier, and the cover seemed newer compared to the rest of the apartment. I reached up and twisted it to take it down, and that's when I saw wires leading to what looked like a small camera lens inside. My heart started pounding. I just stood there holding it, trying to make sense of what I was looking at. It was definitely a camera. Someone had installed a camera inside the smoke detector in my bedroom. I climbed off the chair and sat on the floor, staring at it in disbelief. My first thought was that it had to be a mistake. Maybe it was left there by a previous tenant, or maybe it wasn't even functional anymore. But the light was blinking, which meant it was on. Someone had been watching me. I felt sick. I couldn't stay calm. I started looking around the apartment, checking every corner, every fixture, every vent. I found another one in the living room smoke detector. It was the same wires, a camera lens, and that blinking red light. I didn't know what to do. My phone was sitting on the coffee table, and for a moment, I was afraid to even touch it. What if someone was listening to me too? I sat there for a while, just trying to figure out my next move. Eventually, I decided to call the police. The officer who answered told me to leave everything as it was and not touch anything else. They sent 2 officers to my apartment within 20 minutes. When they arrived, I showed them what I'd found. They took the detectors and said they'd have someone look at the cameras. One of the officers asked me if I knew who had access to the apartment. The only person I could think of was Mr. Davis. He had a spare key, and as far as I knew, he was the only one who did. I told them about him, and they said they'd follow up. They also told me to stay somewhere else for a while, just to be safe. I called a friend and asked if I could crash at her place. I packed a bag and left that night. The next morning, the police called me to come to the station. They had found something. When I got there, they told me that the cameras in the smoke detectors were live streaming footage to a device. They traced it back to Mr. Davis's office in the building. Apparently, he'd set up cameras in multiple apartments, not just mine. He'd been watching tenants for who knows how long. They found recordings on his computer, and when they arrested him, he didn't even try to deny it. I felt violated in a way I can't even describe. The idea that someone had been watching me in my most private moments made my skin crawl. I couldn't go back to that apartment, not even to get the rest of my things. My friend went with me, and I had movers take care of the rest. I found a new place after that, but it took me months to feel safe again. Even now, I check every smoke detector, every vent, every outlet, and every corner of any place I stay. It's not paranoia, it's just the reality of what happened to me. I can't stop thinking about how long he'd been doing this or how many people he'd watched. The police said he had footage from years ago, from tenants who probably never even realized they were being filmed. I'm just glad I found those cameras when I did. I don't even want to imagine how much worse it could have been if I hadn't noticed that blinking light. I've been chalking every morning for years. It's just part of my routine, nothing special. I usually hit the same route, about a 3-mile stretch through the park near my apartment, where there's a bench about halfway along the path. That bench has always been empty, except for one person. At first, I didn't think much of it. He just looked like someone else with a routine. Maybe an older guy, in his 50s or so, sitting on the bench with a coffee cup in hand. Same time every day, around 7:30 a.m. He didn't seem like a threat, just a guy sitting there, watching the park. But after a few days, I started noticing the pattern. Same guy. Same bench. Same time. It wasn't like he was staring at me, but he was always there when I passed by. I'd say I'd nod or wave, and he'd just smile, but I didn't think too much about it. Maybe he was a local, like me, and liked to be outside in the morning. It was probably about 2 weeks in when things started to feel off. He hadn't said anything to me, just observed as I jogged past. I started getting the sense that he was watching me more than I had originally thought. It wasn't creepy at first, just odd. But I couldn't shake the feeling, so I picked up my pace when I passed him, kept my head straight ahead. One morning, I saw him standing by the bench as I approached. I didn't expect it, he had never stood before. He was just standing there, sipping his coffee, looking at me like he was waiting for something. I made the mistake of meeting his gaze as I ran past. He smiled at me, but it wasn't a normal smile. It wasn't friendly. It was more knowing, like he'd been expecting me. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face. I tried to brush it off. It was probably nothing, right? Just an old guy with a habit. People are creatures of routine. But I kept thinking about that smile, how out of place it felt. The next day, I jogged my usual route again. I was determined to not let it get to me. And there he was, sitting on the bench. Same time. Same position. I didn't look at him this time. I just kept my eyes on the path ahead and picked up my pace even more, trying to shake off the feeling that he was following my every movement. I'm not sure what it was, maybe it was the way he was sitting or the way he had looked at me the day before, but I decided to do something different the next morning. I got up earlier, changed my route just slightly, hoping to avoid the whole bench scene. It didn't work. He was there. And this time, when I jogged past, he stood up. "Hey," he called out, his voice a little raspy but calm. I didn't want to stop. I didn't want to engage, but I did anyway. "Hey," I replied, my heart starting to race a little. "I see you every morning," he said, stepping a little closer to the path. "You jog this way a lot." "Yeah," I said, trying to keep my tone casual, trying not to sound rooted out. "It's my route." He smiled again, that same, knowing smile. "You run fast," he said. "Can you keep up with me?" I didn't answer. I just kept running, faster now, trying to distance myself. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw him start jogging behind me. He was keeping pace with me, staying right next to me, without even breaking a sweat. I didn't want to engage, but I couldn't help myself. The whole thing felt so strange, so uncomfortable. He was too close now, almost shoulder to shoulder, matching my speed. "So where you headed?" he asked, his voice steady. "I've seen you pass by here every day. You live nearby?" I didn't answer him. I kept running, my mind racing. Should I tell him to leave me alone? Should I ask if he's okay? I didn't know what to say, but I didn't want to stop. I didn't want to give him any more attention. "Come on, don't be like that," he said, clearly enjoying the situation. "I'm just trying to talk to you." I was trying to keep my breathing steady, trying not to let him see how much I was freaking out. I glanced over at him quickly, and he was still grinning, like he was enjoying this chase. Finally, I made a sharp turn toward the exit of the park, hoping that would throw him off. But he didn't stop. He didn't even slow down. He was still right there, running beside me, not saying anything now, just keeping in time with my steps. My heart was pounding in my chest now, and all I could think was, what does he want from me? I pushed harder, not looking back, but I could feel him there, still beside me. As I neared the end of the park, I turned sharply and ducked behind a tree to get off the path. I crouched down, holding my breath. I waited, listening for any sign of him. I stayed hidden for what felt like hours, but after a few minutes, I heard his footsteps moving away, slowly at first, then fading completely. I waited a little longer before getting up and walking back toward my apartment. That night, I told my friend about what happened. He said I should report it, but I wasn't sure. Maybe it was nothing, maybe I was just overreacting. But every morning after that, I kept checking the bench when I jogged by. He was always there. And every time, I ran faster. Eventually, I stopped seeing him. Maybe he moved on. Maybe he just got bored. But I never forgot the look in his eyes when he smiled at me. And every time I go for a run now, I can't help but feel like someone's watching me. It happened a few months ago, and I still don't feel comfortable talking about it. But after what happened, I haven't been able to shake it, so I need to get it off my chest. It was just a normal night. My girlfriend and I were at home, watching TV, the usual routine. The kind of night where you feel like nothing could go wrong. We were in the middle of a movie, the kind that you get so absorbed in that you stop noticing the time passing. It was late, I'd say around 11:30 or so. Then, suddenly, we heard a knock at the door. It wasn't a loud knock. It was soft, almost hesitant, like the kind you hear from someone who's not quite sure if they should even knock. My girlfriend looked at me, and I could tell from the look on her face that she didn't expect anyone at this hour either. We don't get a lot of visitors, especially late at night. I got up to check through the peephole, and there was a man standing there. He looked average, maybe in his late 30s, wearing a jacket and jeans. Nothing that really stood out. But what made me hesitate wasn't his appearance, it was the fact that I didn't recognize him. And at this hour, I wasn't exactly expecting anyone, let alone a stranger. I took a deep breath, then opened the door a crack. "Can I help you?" I asked. He gave a nervous little laugh, almost as if he was embarrassed to be standing there. "Sorry," he said, rubbing the back of his neck. "I think I'm at the wrong house." I didn't know what to say. I glanced over at my girlfriend, who was now standing behind me, clearly curious. I didn't want to be rude, but this was strange. "You sure?" I asked, still holding the door just slightly open. Yeah, he said quickly, then added, "I was looking for a friend of mine." I thought this was their house, but guess not. "Sorry to bother you." I didn't know what to do. I mean, people make mistakes. Maybe he had the wrong address. Maybe he was just confused. I didn't see any harm in it, so I just nodded and said, "All right. Good night." The man didn't say anything else, he just nodded, turned around, and walked away. I closed the door, still feeling a little unsettled. It wasn't that the interaction was weird, exactly. But something about the whole thing felt off. It was late, and I don't know if it was just the time of night or the man's strange energy, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I told myself I was overthinking it and went back to the couch. My girlfriend asked me if I thought the guy was actually lost, and I said, probably, yeah. Nothing to worry about. But we both kept glancing toward the window, or we could see the street outside. For some reason, the man's face kept flashing in my mind. Something in his eyes had unsettled me. About 10 minutes later, I noticed a car pulling up across the street. It was parked in front of a house next door, but the street was pretty quiet, and it was a dark-colored car. I didn't think much of it at first, just another vehicle on the street. But then, as I looked closer, I saw a figure sitting in the driver's seat. I couldn't make out details, but I swore it looked like the same man from earlier. I don't know why I thought that. Maybe it was his build, or just a gut feeling. But I couldn't help but stare. I didn't say anything at first, just watched the car for a while. It was parked across the street, engine off, headlights dimmed. "Is that him?" my girlfriend whispered, her voice shaky. I don't know how she knew, but I felt a cold chill run through me. I nodded slowly. For a few minutes, nothing happened. The car just sat there, and I thought, maybe I was overreacting. Maybe it was a coincidence. But then, the man started moving. He didn't get out of the car, though. Instead, he just sat there, staring at our house. I could see him clearly now, even though it was dark. His eyes were fixed on our window, and it felt like he was looking right through the walls. My heart began to race. I told myself it was probably nothing. Maybe he was just waiting for someone. Maybe he had parked there and fell asleep. But deep down, I knew it didn't sit right with me. "I'm going to call the cops," my girlfriend said, standing up, her voice trembling. "This is weird." Before I could respond, the man in the car did something that made my blood run cold. He slowly turned his head, not to look down the street, but straight at our window. I couldn't see his face clearly, but I could tell that he was staring at us. It was like he knew we were watching him, and he was daring us to look away. I froze. I couldn't explain why, but in that moment, I felt completely exposed. Like he had been watching us for longer than I realized. My girlfriend was already reaching for the phone, and I went to pull the blinds down quickly. But when I moved, I heard the car engine start. The car didn't drive off, though. It just sat there idling for what felt like forever, and then, without warning, it slowly began to back up and pull away. I couldn't help but keep my eyes on it as it drove away down the street. I could still see his face in my mind, the look in his eyes, the way he had looked directly at us. It wasn't just a glance. It felt deliberate. We called the cops anyway, but by the time they arrived, the car was long gone. They said they couldn't do much without evidence, but they promised to keep an eye on the area. The rest of the night, we didn't sleep. We kept checking the windows, the door, even the street, but nothing else happened. The man didn't return, and there was no sign of him the next few days. I tried to convince myself it was just a strange incident, a coincidence. But I still feel it, every time I walk past that window, that uneasy feeling that someone might be watching. Every time I see a car parked across the street, my mind flashes to that moment I saw his eyes staring right at me. It's been a few weeks since that night, and I still haven't seen that man again. I don't know what he wanted, or why he did what he did, but I don't feel safe anymore. And I don't think I'll ever forget the way he looked at me, standing there across the street, like he knew something I didn't. This happened not too long ago, and I still don't know how to process it. I wish I could just forget about it, but every time I go to my favorite coffee shop, I can't help but look over my shoulder. It all started one morning when I was at my usual coffee spot. I go there almost every day, the same time, the same order, a simple habit that gave me comfort. It's a cozy little place with a few tables and a lot of character. I love the atmosphere, and the baristas are friendly. It's the kind of place where you can relax, get some work done, and just blend into the background. That particular day, I was sitting near the window, sipping my coffee, and I decided to post a few pictures of the shop on Instagram. Nothing special, just some photos of the place, one of the coffee bar, another of the cozy nook by the window. I was really into posting little updates like that, sharing what I was doing, where I was, but it was never anything too personal. Just simple things. The post got a couple of likes, nothing too crazy, and I didn't think much about it afterward. Like I said, it was just something I did. I've always been a bit active on social media, but not to the point where it ever felt weird. It was just sharing little snippets of my day. A few days later, I walked into the coffee shop like usual. It was busy, which was normal for a weekend morning. I ordered my coffee, went to pay, and as I turned around to grab my drink, I noticed a man standing near the counter, just looking at me. He wasn't staring at me in an obvious way, but there was something about his eyes that made me feel uncomfortable. He was probably in his mid-30s, tall, dressed casually. Nothing too out of the ordinary. He smiled and waved, and I awkwardly waved back, unsure of who he was. He wasn't someone I recognized. At least, I didn't think so. "Hey, I think I've seen you here before," he said. His tone was friendly, but it felt forced, like he was trying a bit too hard to make a connection. "I saw your post the other day. The one about the coffee shop. You really like this place, huh?" I froze for a second. How did he know about my post? I hadn't shared it with anyone directly, just a public Instagram story. But the fact that he brought it up, so casually, felt a little off. "Yeah, I do," I said, trying to keep it light. "It's one of my favorites." He smiled again, and I could tell he was trying to be friendly, but something about his presence made me uneasy. "I saw your post," he repeated, and I thought, wow, that's funny, I come here all the time too. I nodded, not sure how to respond. At that point, I just wanted to get my coffee and sit down, but he kept talking. "I actually noticed a few other posts of yours too," he said. "Like the one from last week, you went to that restaurant on 5th. I go there sometimes." I didn't know how to respond. It wasn't like I posted anything secretive, but the fact that he knew all these details about my life made me feel uncomfortable. I had posted those things on my Instagram, sure, but I didn't think anyone would really keep track of them. Maybe I was being paranoid, but this felt like more than just coincidence. "Oh, yeah, that place is good," I said, trying to sound casual. He smiled wider. "It's funny. I always see you posting about the places you go. You have some great taste in spots." His tone was friendly, but there was something about it that felt off. Like he was trying to push a little too hard to seem familiar. I wasn't sure if he was trying to be polite, or if he was just a little too invested in my posts. Either way, it didn't sit well with me. "Well, thanks," I said, finally managing to grab my coffee. "I need to get going, actually." He stepped a little closer as I started to walk away, blocking my path just slightly. "Hey, maybe we could grab a coffee sometime, you know? Talk about all the cool places you post about. I'd love to hear more." I felt my stomach turn. I wasn't the kind of person to be rude, but I didn't know how to handle this. I didn't know him, and his sudden interest in my social media posts made me feel uncomfortable. "I'm not sure about that," I said, stepping around him. "But thanks anyway." I didn't wait for him to respond. I just walked away quickly, trying not to glance back. I found a seat in the far corner, away from the counter, and tried to focus on my coffee. But my mind kept racing. Who was this guy? Why did he know so much about me? I didn't want to be paranoid, but it felt strange. Too strange. For the rest of that morning, I kept glancing over at him. He stayed at the counter, talking to the barista, but he kept looking over at me every few minutes. It was subtle, but it was enough to make me uncomfortable. I kept thinking, what did he want? Why was he so interested in me? I finished my coffee and left as quickly as I could. I was relieved when I finally stepped outside, but the feeling of unease didn't go away. That night, I checked my social media. I hadn't posted anything else since that morning, but I did notice that my recent posts had a lot more engagement than usual. A lot more comments, a lot more followers. And one of those comments, from an account I didn't recognize, was a message saying, "Hope to see you around again soon." I didn't know what to make of it. The next time I went back to the coffee shop, I didn't see him right away. But about 10 minutes into sitting down with my coffee, I saw him enter. He looked over at me, and for a second, I thought he might just wave and go about his business. But instead, he walked straight toward me, a wide grin on his face. "Hey," he said, almost too loudly. "We meet again. So, did you check out that place I told you about? I bet you've been there." I tried to keep my voice steady. "I don't think we've met," I said, trying to stay polite but firm. "And I don't remember talking about that." His smile faltered for a second, but then he seemed to recover. "Oh, sorry. I guess I must have gotten confused. You really like to go to a lot of places, huh?" I didn't know how to get out of this conversation. My heart was beating faster. I didn't know what he wanted or why he was following me, but something about the situation didn't feel right. I was trying to stay calm, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was getting too familiar, too quickly. "I think I need to get going," I said, standing up quickly. "Thanks for the chat, but I have to go." I didn't wait for him to respond. I left the coffee shop as fast as I could, looking over my shoulder the entire time. I didn't see him follow me out, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching. It's been a few weeks since then, and I haven't seen him again at the coffee shop, but I've noticed a lot more people commenting on my social media. I don't know if it's him or just a coincidence, but I've been extra careful about what I post now. I can't shake the feeling that he's still out there, watching, waiting for another chance to talk to me. And I don't know what he wants, but it scares me to think about it. I'm still not sure what exactly happened that night, but the whole experience left me feeling uneasy, and I haven't been able to shake it off since. I had just finished a long week at work, and I was feeling kind of worn out. It was one of those nights where I just wanted a good meal and some time alone. I decided to go to a restaurant I had been meaning to try for a while. It was a quiet, small place, nothing fancy, just a cozy spot where you could relax and enjoy some decent food. I figured it would be the perfect place to unwind. I walked in and was immediately greeted by the hostess. She was polite, showed me to a table near the window, and handed me a menu. I didn't think much of it at the time, just another routine dinner out. The restaurant wasn't busy, just a few other people scattered around, but it had a calm, almost intimate vibe. I sat there, looking over the menu, and that's when I first noticed the waiter. He wasn't exactly standing near my table, but he kept glancing over at me. It wasn't a casual glance either. Every time I looked up from my menu, he was looking directly at me. At first, I thought maybe I was just being paranoid. Maybe he was just doing his job, making sure customers were taken care of, or maybe he was just waiting for his turn to speak. But after a few more minutes, it became pretty clear he was staring at me. It wasn't a quick glance. It was more like he was watching me, just standing there off to the side, watching me eat. He didn't seem to be doing anything else, just watching. It started to make me feel uncomfortable. I tried to ignore it and go back to my meal, but every time I looked up, he was there, standing still, staring at me. I was already uncomfortable enough to start second-guessing myself. Maybe he was just waiting for me to ask for something. I wasn't sure, but the more I thought about it, the more I started to feel like something wasn't right. After a while, I decided I couldn't just sit there anymore. I called the waiter over to take my plate and asked for the check. As he was taking my plate, I mentioned casually, "You've been staring at me for a while. Is something wrong?" He didn't even blink. He just smiled a little and said, "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable." It didn't feel like an apology, it was more like he was just trying to brush it off. I paid for my meal, but the entire time I felt like something was off. The waiter left quickly, almost as if he didn't want to talk to me anymore. I paid and left a tip, but I was still feeling uneasy. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something weird about the whole interaction. After I walked out, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I had a strange gut feeling that I couldn't explain. So, when I got to my car and was about to drive off, I decided to go back inside. I wasn't sure what I was hoping to accomplish, but I just needed some answers. I walked back in through the front door, and the hostess greeted me again, almost like I hadn't left. I went up to the counter and told her I wanted to speak to the manager. I don't know why, but I felt like something wasn't right. The manager came over after a few minutes, and I could tell he was a little puzzled. "Can I help you with something, sir?" "Yeah, I just had dinner here, and I noticed something odd," I said, trying to sound casual, but it was hard to hide the tension I felt. I had a waiter who kept staring at me during my meal. It made me uncomfortable, so I left, but now I'm just wondering, was there anyone working here who fits that description? He gave me a confused look. "I'm not sure what you mean, but I'll check the schedule." "What did he look like?" I gave him a brief description: tall, dark hair, wearing a white shirt and black pants. The manager didn't seem to recognize the description at first, but he quickly went over to the staff schedule and started looking through it. I stood there, feeling like I had just walked into something I shouldn't have. After a minute, he turned around and said, "We don't have anyone working here with that description. No one with dark hair and that build. Are you sure you were in the right restaurant?" I blinked, not sure if I had heard him right. "What do you mean?" "I was just here. The guy served me my food and everything." The manager didn't say anything for a moment, just stared at me, almost like he was trying to figure out if I was playing some kind of joke. "I'm sorry, but I really don't know who you're talking about. Maybe you confused him with someone else." I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I wasn't confused. I knew what I saw. I had just sat there, watching him stare at me the whole time. I didn't understand how the manager could be so sure that no one like that worked there. I mean, the guy had served me my food. I had seen him clearly. But when I looked at the schedule, sure enough, no one even remotely resembled the waiter I had described. It didn't make any sense. I asked the manager a few more questions, but he just kept repeating the same thing. There was no one matching my description. I left the restaurant, and the whole thing just felt wrong. I'm not saying I saw a ghost or anything, but the more I thought about it, the more I felt like I was being gaslit. There was no way I had imagined it all. I had seen that man, and he had surfed me. He had been staring at me the entire time. I don't know if I'll ever know what happened. I've been back to that restaurant since, but I've never seen that waiter again. And honestly, I haven't seen anyone who even remotely matches his description. But every time I walk by the spot where I sat, I feel like something's off. Maybe it was all just some weird misunderstanding, but I can't shake the feeling that something strange happened that night, and I'm not sure I'll ever understand it. I've been thinking about whether or not I should share this for a while now. I'm still not sure if it was just a really bad experience or something more serious. But I can't get the feeling out of my mind. What happened that day felt so wrong. It all started a few weeks ago when I was looking for a new job. I'd been searching online for a while, and I was getting kind of desperate. Bills were piling up, and I just needed something. That's when I saw an ad for a job I was interested in. It seemed legit at first. The company's website looked professional, and the job description fit what I was looking for. So, I applied. I heard back from them pretty quickly. They sent me an email saying they wanted to schedule an interview. I was relieved, excited even. It wasn't a huge company, but it was something. The email provided an address for their office, and they told me to come in the next day at 10 a.m. I remember feeling nervous, but also optimistic. I prepared for the interview as best as I could. I didn't know exactly what to expect, but I put on my best outfit, grabbed a copy of my resume, and headed out the door. When I got to the address, I was a little thrown off. The building was older, and it didn't look like a typical office building. It was tucked away in a corner of a quiet street. The area didn't have the hustle and bustle you'd expect from a place where businesses were located. Still, I didn't think much of it. I figured the company was just in a smaller space. I went inside, and it wasn't a grand reception area like I had imagined. There was no one at the front desk. It felt a bit off, but I didn't think anything of it at first. I checked the email again, confirming the details. I had the right place. After standing there for a few seconds, I heard a noise from down the hall. Someone appeared from a door at the end of the corridor and waved me over. He looked like he was in his mid-30s, wearing a business suit, and gave off the vibe of someone who worked in an office environment, though he didn't look super polished, kind of like he was just starting his day. He didn't have the best energy, but he smiled at me as if to reassure me. "Are you here for the interview?" he asked. I nodded. "Yes, I am." "Great." "Follow me," he said, and then turned and walked down the hallway. I followed him down the long, dimly lit corridor. The whole place seemed kind of quiet, almost eerily so. I don't know why, but I felt a little uncomfortable, but I brushed it off. It was probably just nerves. We stopped at the last door on the left. He opened it and gestured for me to go inside. The room was small, with just a table and a few chairs scattered around. There was no receptionist or assistant, just a table with some papers on it and a lamp that flickered slightly. The man motioned for me to sit. I did, sitting down in one of the chairs, and he sat across from me. He didn't say anything for a moment, just looked at me as though he was sizing me up. I was a little unsure of what was going on. This wasn't exactly what I had imagined a job interview to be like. Finally, he spoke. "You must be wondering why we didn't have a formal reception area, huh?" I didn't know how to respond, so I just nodded. "Sometimes we like to keep things low-key around here," he continued. "Makes it easier to find the right people." I didn't know what he meant by that, but I just smiled and tried to stay professional. The next few minutes were strange. He started asking me questions about my resume, but it wasn't the usual stuff. He was asking about personal things, what I did in my free time, what kind of movies I liked, and questions that seemed a little invasive. It was odd, but I figured maybe it was part of the process. I tried to answer as best I could, though I kept feeling like something wasn't quite right. Then, after a few minutes, he got up and locked the door behind me. I didn't think anything of it at first. Maybe he was just securing the room. But then he came back to the table and sat down, and he had a different look in his eyes, like he was studying me more intensely than before. "Actually," he said, leaning forward, "I don't think you fully understood the nature of the job you applied for." I felt my heart skip a beat. What did he mean? This wasn't going the way I had expected. "What do you mean?" I asked, trying to keep calm. "I applied for the marketing position." "That's what the listing said." He smiled, but it wasn't a reassuring smile. "I think you misunderstood," he said. "You weren't applying for a marketing job. This is a different kind of work." I didn't know what to say. My mind was racing, trying to piece things together. My body was tense. Something was wrong, and I knew it. "Wait," I said, trying to stand up. "What is this?" "What do you mean?" Before I could get up, he stood up quickly and stepped closer to me. "Sit down," he said, his voice calm but forceful. "Let me explain." I froze, sitting back down in the chair as he began talking. He kept saying things that didn't make sense, things like, "You'll be part of a small team, and we'll take care of everything for you." But nothing he said added up. The more he spoke, the more I felt like I had stumbled into something much worse than I could have ever imagined. "Listen," I said, my voice shaky. "This isn't what I signed up for. I think I need to leave." He didn't even flinch. He just stood there and looked at me with a kind of blank expression. "It's too late for that," he said quietly. "You're already here. And now you're part of the team." I was starting to panic. My heart was racing, and I could feel a cold sweat form me. I tried the door, but it was locked. I stood up quickly, but he blocked the way. I knew I had to leave. I had to get out. I wasn't sure what was going on, but I wasn't going to stay there to find out. "I'm not part of any team." I yelled. "Let me out of here." His face remained calm. He didn't even blink. "You're not leaving yet," he said. "Not until you understand what you're really here for." My head was spinning. I felt like I was going to lose it. Then, something inside me snapped. I bolted toward the door and shoved past him. I was terrified, but I knew I had to get out. He didn't try to stop me as I rushed out of the room and down the hall. I heard him calling after me, but I didn't stop to listen. I didn't care anymore. I rushed out of the building, and I didn't stop running until I was far away from that place. I don't know what would have happened if I had stayed, but I'm sure it wasn't good. I haven't been able to stop thinking about that day. I haven't heard from the company, and I don't want to. I'm not sure what that man was trying to do, but I know it wasn't a job interview. This happened a couple of months ago, and I still can't get over how creepy it all was. I'd been having a rough week and decided to take a drive just to clear my head. I ended up at this parking lot near a grocery store. It was pretty quiet, not many cars around, and I figured it'd be a good spot to park for a while. I parked in the back row, as far from everyone else as I could. There wasn't a specific reason I chose that spot, but it just felt like it'd be a good place to chill for a bit without anyone bothering me. I was just sitting there, scrolling through my phone and not really paying attention to much else. Then, I noticed something that made me feel a little uneasy. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw a car pull into the lot and park a few spaces away from me. It wasn't too close, but close enough that I could see it. I didn't think much of it at first, just assumed it was someone else doing the same thing as me, just parking and sitting for a while. But then, I started noticing the car's headlights. The car wasn't turned off. The headlights were on, and they were shining directly toward my car. That's when I felt the first stir of discomfort. I thought it was weird, but I didn't think it was anything to get worked up about. Maybe they were just sitting there, too. Maybe they were waiting for someone. A few minutes passed, and I started to think maybe it was just my imagination, or maybe I was being paranoid. But then I looked up again, and I realized something. The driver was staring right at me. Not just looking in my general direction, but staring directly at me. I couldn't see much through the tinted windows, but it was enough that I felt like something wasn't right. I glanced over at my rearview mirror to see if anyone else was around. The parking lot was still empty, aside from the two cars, mine and the one that had just pulled in. It was getting late, so I figured people were starting to leave, but this person was still sitting there. At this point, I was starting to feel uneasy. My gut was telling me something was wrong, but I didn't want to overreact. So, I sat there, still scrolling through my phone, trying to convince myself I was being paranoid. After what felt like forever but was probably only 10 or 15 minutes, I decided I'd had enough. I didn't need to stay there anymore, so I started the engine and put the car in reverse. But as I was backing up, I saw the other car start to move. It wasn't just a casual pull-out. The car was moving into the space directly behind mine, blocking my way out. At this point, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was really wrong. My heart started to race a little. I stopped, thinking maybe they were just maneuvering their car, but when I looked up, I saw that the driver had gotten out of their car. I couldn't see much of them at first, just a shadow moving towards me, but then the person came into full view. They were wearing a hoodie, and their face was partially obscured, but they were walking directly toward my car. I felt my chest tighten. My first thought was to lock the doors, which I did immediately. I wasn't sure what was happening, but I wasn't about to just sit there and wait to see what this person was up to. The man reached my window and just stood there for a second, staring at me. I didn't know what to do. I wanted to roll my window down and ask if everything was okay, but the guy just kept standing there. Then, without any warning, he slammed his hand against the window. The sound of it echoed in the car, and it made me jump, my heart nearly stopping. I froze, staring at him, not knowing what he wanted. He didn't say anything at first. He just kept staring at me, his hand still pressed against the window. Then he knocked once, twice, and finally spoke, his voice sounding like he was annoyed or frustrated. "You need to move your car," he said. I didn't respond right away. I didn't know what he wanted from me. There was no way he could have missed the fact I was trying to leave. I'd already started backing up. But now, with him standing in front of my car like that, I had no idea what his intentions were. I looked around, hoping to see someone else in the parking lot, but it was empty. There was no one. I didn't know if I should try to leave or just sit there and wait for him to leave. My instinct was screaming at me to drive off, but I didn't want to make a move that might escalate things. I started to slowly roll my window down, just enough so that I could talk to him without exposing myself too much. "I'm trying to leave," I said, my voice coming out shakier than I wanted. "You're blocking me in." The man didn't respond. Instead, he just kept standing there, his face partially covered by the hoodie, his eyes hidden. I couldn't read his expression, but I could feel the tension in the air. It was like I was trapped in this moment where everything was wrong, and I didn't know how to get out of it. Finally, he knocked on the window again, this time harder. "Move your car," he repeated, louder. "I'm not asking." At that moment, something inside me snapped. I wasn't going to wait around to find out what he was capable of. I slammed my car into drive, and without a second thought, I sped forward, bumping his car lightly as I pushed through. I didn't look back, but I could hear him yelling something as I drove away. I didn't stop until I was far enough away from the parking lot. My hands were shaky, my mind racing. I didn't know what that man wanted, but I knew I wasn't sticking around to find out. After that night, I never went back to that parking lot again. I don't know what would have happened if I hadn't decided to drive off, but I'm not taking any chances. I can't shake the feeling that I narrowly avoided something bad. Something worse. I haven't told anyone about it, because I don't want people to think I'm overreacting. But I know I saw, and I won't ever forget it. I don't know who that guy was or what he wanted, but I'm sure it wasn't good. I wasn't sure why I was expecting when I checked into the hotel. It was a last-minute booking after a long day of travel, and honestly, I was just looking forward to getting some sleep. I'd been on the road for nearly 12 hours and my body was aching. So when I arrived at the hotel, I didn't really pay much attention to the details. I grabbed my room key and made my way up to the 3rd floor, expecting to just crash and forget about the world for a few hours. The room was pretty standard for a mid-range hotel, nothing fancy, but it had everything I needed. A bed, a small desk, a TV that I wasn't going to use, and a bathroom that was far too small for my liking. But at that point, I didn't care. I was just glad to have a roof over my head for the night. I locked the door behind me, unpacked a few things, and threw myself on the bed. The hotel was quiet. Too quiet, if I'm being honest, but I didn't think much of it. It was late, and I figured most of the other guests were already asleep. I set my alarm for an early start the next day, and I pulled the covers up, sinking into the warmth of the bed. It didn't take long for me to fall asleep. I was exhausted, and the comfort of the hotel bed quickly lulled me into a deep, dreamless slumber. The first thing that woke me up was the sound of my door unlocking. At first, I thought I was imagining it. I blinked a few times, trying to shake off the remnants of sleep. But then, I heard it again, the unmistakable sound of a key turning in the lock, followed by a soft click. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I wasn't expecting anyone. I hadn't ordered room service, and I hadn't told anyone I was in town, so why would someone be unlocking my door at this hour? I listened, straining to hear any sounds, but everything was eerily quiet. I told myself it was probably just the hotel staff, maybe they were checking something, doing a routine check, or maybe it was a mistake. They could have been given the wrong room key by mistake. But that didn't explain why the door opened. I was too scared to move, but my curiosity pushed me to inch closer to the door. I could hear soft footsteps, almost hesitant. The door cracked open just a little more, and I could see the shadow of someone standing in the hallway. Then the door opened all the way. A man stood there, staring at me with wide eyes. He looked disoriented, like he'd just woken up himself. He was holding a room key, and he looked down at it, then back at me. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice shaky, "I think there's been a mistake. I was given this room key at the front desk. Well, I'm supposed to be in here." I sat up in bed, blinking in disbelief. "What?" The man took a step into the room. His clothes were disheveled, as though he'd been traveling or just got out of bed. His hair was messy, and he had that look on his face, the one people get when they don't quite know what's going on. I could see him glancing around the room, clearly confused. "I'm really sorry," he repeated. "They must have given me the wrong key." I stared at him, still trying to process what was happening. My first instinct was to get up, but I didn't. I couldn't. Something about the way he stood there, looking like he didn't belong, made me feel like I was the one who didn't belong in the room. I should have said something, called the front desk, but the words didn't come out. "You're sure you're in the right room?" I asked, trying to make sense of it. Maybe he'd gotten confused. Maybe he was just tired. Maybe he just made a mistake. But even as I asked, I knew something was wrong. I could feel it in my gut. "I don't know," he said, fidgeting with the key in his hand. He looked over at me again, his face a mix of confusion and embarrassment. "They told me this was where I was supposed to be." There was an odd hesitation in his voice, something off. And yet, there was this genuine, almost apologetic tone in the way he spoke. Something felt wrong. I quickly glanced at the door, then back at the man. It all felt surreal. Why would he walk into a room at this hour, acting so casual about it? Why didn't he immediately apologize and leave when he realized his mistake? "Okay, I think you need to go back downstairs," I said, my voice trembling slightly. "I'm not sure what happened, but..." Before I could finish, the man stepped further into the room, his presence blocking the doorway. He didn't push past me, but he didn't move either. He stood there, still holding the key, staring at me as if he was processing something. The more I've looked at him, the more I've realized how out of place he seemed. I tried to stand up, but something stopped me. The room felt smaller now, almost like the walls were closing in. There was this feeling in the pit of my stomach, a sense of unease that kept growing. My hand reached for my phone on the bedside table, but I was too slow. "I'm really sorry," the man said again, his eyes never leaving mine. "I didn't mean to intrude. But this is my room, right?" I swallowed hard. My heart was racing, and I could feel my palms starting to sweat. Something about the way he asked the question, it was like he didn't even care whether he was supposed to be there or not. I finally found my voice. "No, it's not. I've been here all night. I'm the one staying here." I reached for my phone again, this time with more urgency. But the man took a step forward, and I froze. "No, it's fine," he said quickly, his tone suddenly shifting. There was a forced calmness to his voice now, almost too calm. "It's just a mistake. I'll go down and get it sorted out. I'm really sorry." But he didn't move. For a few seconds, we just stood there, eye to eye, in that silent space between us. My mind was spinning, and I couldn't make sense of what was happening. It didn't feel like an accident anymore. It felt deliberate. "All right," I said, slowly, my voice shaky. "I'm calling the front desk now." I held my phone up, but the man suddenly snapped out of his daze and backed away from me. His expression shifted again, his eyes darting around the room as if realizing how far he'd crossed the line. "Yeah, of course," he mumbled, his voice quiet, almost as if he wasn't sure of himself anymore. I'll go get this fixed." And just like that, he turned, walking out of the room, his footsteps fading down the hallway. I waited a few moments, my heart still racing, before I picked up the phone and dialed the front desk. The person on the other end answered quickly, sounding cheerful. "Front desk, how can I help you?" "Yeah," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "there's been a mistake. Someone just walked into my room with a key. They said it was the same key I was given, but there's no way that's possible. Can you double-check the room assignments for me?" There was a brief pause. Of course, the clerk replied, her voice suddenly more businesslike. Give me one moment. She came back to the phone, her tone much more serious now. I'm sorry, but according to our system, there's no record of anyone being assigned that room key tonight. Are you sure the person you spoke to was from the hotel? I didn't have the words to explain why I was feeling. The man had seemed so convincing, so sure of himself. But now, after hearing that, the whole situation felt even stranger. Why had he been so confident that he belonged there? Why didn't he leave when I asked him to? I don't know what would have happened if I hadn't been awake. I don't know what would have happened if I hadn't been alert enough to hear the door unlock. But I do know one thing now, I'll never look at hotels the same way again. Every time I close my hotel room door, I wonder who else might be on the other side. It started like any other renovation project. I had just bought my first home, a little place on the edge of town, and it needed a lot of work. The floors were creaky, the walls were covered in old wallpaper, and the kitchen was stuck in the 90s. But I loved the potential it had, and I was excited to start turning it into something that felt like mine. I hired a local contractor that came highly recommended. The company had decent reviews, and I figured it would be a good fit. They gave me an estimate, went over the work, and within a week, I had a crew come in to start the renovations. For the most part, everything went smoothly. The workers were polite, they showed up on time, and they did what they were supposed to do. It was messy, of course, but that's to be expected with any renovation. I was living in the house while the work was going on, and most of the workers didn't bother me too much, apart from the occasional noise or them asking where to put something. They'd work until late afternoon, and then they'd leave. But then there was Jeff. Jeff was one of the contractors who seemed to take a little longer with his work. At first, I didn't think much of it. It was a big house, and I assumed he was just being thorough. He was probably in his mid-30s, average height, dark hair, and a bit of a rough look to him, but he wasn't rude. He just lingered. At first, I didn't think anything of it. I would leave the house to run errands or go to work, and Jeff would still be there, working. He'd tell me, just want to finish up for the day, or, I'm almost done with this part, and then I'll be out of your way. It wasn't the worst thing in the world, but after a while, it started to feel odd. I never saw the others stick around as long as he did, and honestly, I started to get a little uncomfortable. The first red flag came about 2 weeks into the renovation. I came back early from the store, and I was shocked to find Jeff still in the house, long after everyone else had left. The other contractors were gone for the day, and the house was quiet. I walked in through the back door, and there he was, standing in the kitchen with his back to me. He was alone, surrounded by piles of tools and some debris from where they'd ripped out the cabinets. "Hey, Jeff. You still here?" I asked, trying to sound casual. He turned around and gave me a sheepish smile. "Yeah, just wanted to finish the trim in the kitchen. Thought I could knock it out while everyone was gone." I nodded, but something in the way he said it didn't sit right with me. "Okay, well, be careful with those nails," I said, trying to keep it light. "You don't want to hit a pipe or something." "Don't worry," he said, a little too quickly. "I know what I'm doing. Just need a few more minutes." He didn't leave until about an hour later. I was already getting dinner ready by then, and I figured it was just part of the process. But then, over the next few days, the same thing kept happening. I'd come home, and Jeff would be there, working alone. Sometimes, I'd see him like I home from errands. Other times, I hear him moving around in the house, long after the others had left. One evening, I came back from work later than usual, and when I walked through the front door, I saw that the lights were on in the living room, even though I'd been expecting the house to be empty. At first, I thought maybe I'd left a light on by mistake, but then I saw Chef standing by the windowsill, staring out the front of the house. "Chef!" I called out, a little louder this time, feeling the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. He turned to face me, his expression unreadable. "Oh, hey," he said, as if nothing was unusual. "I didn't mean to startle you. Just thought I'd finish up the last of the painting." I stared at him for a moment. "It's late. Don't you think you should go home?" He didn't immediately respond. He just stood there, his eyes meeting mine for a moment before he finally nodded. Yeah, I'll head out soon. Just need to clean up a bit, and I'll be gone." I didn't like it. I didn't like that he was here at such a late hour, especially without telling me. I told myself I was probably overreacting, maybe he just wanted to get the job done. But every time I saw him lingering after hours, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. A few days later, I stayed home to work from the house. I had a few meetings, and I figured it would be a good chance to observe the progress without leaving for long stretches of time. By midday, most of the crew had packed up and left, and I was alone in the house with just Jeff there, as usual. He told me he needed to finish up a few things in the bathroom, so I stayed in my office, trying to focus on work. About an hour later, I got up to grab some water and noticed that the bathroom door was closed, which I thought was odd. I hadn't heard any work being done for a while, and I figured he had left for the day. But when I walked past the door, I heard the unmistakable sound of someone breathing heavily, like they were trying to be quiet. I froze, my heart pounding. I wasn't sure why I was hearing, but it didn't sound like normal work noises. I waited for a moment, holding my breath, but it was dead quiet again. After a few seconds, I knocked lightly on the door. "Chef," I called, trying to sound calm, though my voice was shaky. "Everything okay in there?" There was a pause, followed by a quiet, "Yeah, just making sure the floor's level. I'll be done soon." I wanted to ask him why he was still here, why he was taking so long, but instead, I just nodded and went back to my office. The next day, things got worse. Jeff was still staying late, but this time, he started leaving things in the house. Tools, a bag of cement, a few paint cans, nothing huge, but it was strange. When I asked him about it, he said he was just storing stuff overnight. That was when I decided to call the contractor and check in. I hadn't mentioned any of my concerns to the contractor before, figuring I was just being paranoid, but I couldn't take it anymore. I explained the situation, and they assured me it was a mistake, that Jeff was probably just working overtime and forgot to clean up. They promised to send someone else the next day to make sure the job was on track. The next day, the foreman came to inspect the house. When we walked into the kitchen, I was horrified to see that the kitchen windows had been left open, even though the crew always locked everything up before leaving. And then I noticed something even more disturbing. Jeff's tools were scattered around the yard, just lying bare. They weren't where they had been left the night before. I called the police. I didn't know what was going on, but I couldn't ignore it anymore. When they came to question Jeff, he acted strangely. He kept saying he was just trying to finish the work, but he didn't have a reasonable explanation for why he'd stayed late or left tools behind. When they went through his bag, they found nothing of interest, but that didn't make me feel any better. I never saw Jeff again after that. The foreman assured me that he'd been let go, but I wasn't convinced. Even now, months later, I can't shake the feeling that something was wrong that night. I never found out why he stayed so late, or what he was really doing when I wasn't around. I've been wanting the same love for years. It's early mornings, just after sunrise, when the streets are still empty and the air is cool. I like the peace of it, the rhythm of my feet hitting the pavement, my breathing in time with the steady beat of my heart. There's something soothing about being alone with my thoughts. But that morning, everything changed. I was on my usual route, heading down a quieter stretch of the park, when I saw him. He was standing by the sidewalk, looking down at something in his hands. At first, I didn't think anything of it. People are always walking or sitting, especially around the park. As I got closer, he lifted his head and looked right at me. "Excuse me," he called out, his voice a little too loud for the stillness of the morning. I slowed my pace just slightly, not wanting to come off rude, but I wasn't in the mood to stop. "Yeah," I replied, trying to keep my pace up. I wasn't planning on engaging much. "Do you know where the nearest gas station is?" he asked, still standing in the same spot. His hands were shaking slightly, like maybe he was cold or nervous. His clothes were ragged, nothing that screamed normal. Just a plain hoodie and worn-out jeans, nothing remarkable. Yeah, just keep going down the street and turn left at the next light," I said, not wanting to be bothered. I started to pick up speed again, hoping that would end the conversation. But he didn't move. "Actually," he said, his voice quieter now, "I'm kind of lost. Do you know if there's a bus stop around here?" At this point, I was slowing down, not sure how to handle it. He wasn't exactly threatening, but something about his demeanor felt off. He was too still, too intense. And the fact that he hadn't moved from his spot told me something wasn't right. "There's a bus stop about a block away," I said, not breaking stride, trying to give a quick answer and move along. But he wasn't letting up. Can you help me find it?" I stopped. Not fully, but enough that I could look at him. There was something in his eyes, something desperate, almost pleading. The sun was starting to rise higher, casting a warm light on everything around, but I felt a chill run through me. He was standing too close, now taking a step toward me. "I don't know if I can." "I'm just running," I said, my voice tight. The last thing I wanted was to be stuck in a situation where I felt unsafe. He didn't seem to understand. Or maybe he didn't care. "I just need help," he said, his voice quieter now, more insistent. "I'm really lost. It's really important." There was a pause. He seemed to be waiting for something. I felt my chest tighten. My instincts told me to go, to move, to get away, but I stayed. I wanted to be polite. I wanted out, but something in me screamed to walk away. Still, I wasn't sure what to do. I stood there for a second, trying to find the right words, but the moment felt strange, heavy. He was looking at me like he was waiting for me to do something. "I really need to find it." "You're not going anywhere, right?" he asked. "What?" My heart skipped a beat, and I suddenly felt very exposed. He had no business asking me that. No business asking me anything anymore. I took a quick step back. "I've got to go," I said, trying to keep the tremor out of my voice. I turned and began jogging again, but before I could even get a few paces away, I heard his footsteps behind me. Heavy and deliberate. Not the quick, light footfalls of someone who's just out for a morning jog like me. I could feel his presence closing in behind me. I picked up the pace, trying to put distance between us, but he matched it. My heart started pounding in my chest. There was no mistaking it now, he was following me. I looked over my shoulder. He was maybe 10 feet away, and he wasn't slowing down. His pace was steady, determined. And now I was scared. "Why are you following me?" I asked, my voice coming out shaky even though I didn't want it to. He didn't answer. He just kept following, keeping that distance, like he was toying with me. I rounded a corner, hoping to lose him, but when I glanced back again, he was still there, just behind me. His gaze never left me. A sudden panic flooded me. I knew I couldn't outrun him for long, and I didn't want to go any further into the park. It was too isolated, too empty. I thought about calling someone, but I didn't even have my phone with me. There was a bridge ahead, a small overpass that led to a busier street. I made up my mind and began running hard, faster than I'd ever run before, trying to reach that bridge. The sound of his footsteps grew louder behind me, but I didn't dare look back. I made it to the bridge, and for the first time, I risked a glance behind me. He was still there, maybe 20 feet back. But something had changed. The look in his eyes was more urgent now, like he realized he'd almost lost me. I didn't wait to find out what would happen next. I ran as fast as I could, toward the main road where there were cars, people, life. I couldn't risk staying in that park, now with him so close. I made it to the main street and kept going until I reached a convenience store. The door was unlocked, and I rushed inside, breathless, shaking. I looked out the window, but he didn't follow me any further. He had stopped just at the entrance to the park, watching me. And then he turned and disappeared back into the trees. I stayed inside for a while, unsure of what to do. I didn't call the police because I couldn't explain it. Nothing had really happened, right? He hadn't hurt me. He just followed me, made me feel like prey. But it was enough to make my heart race even now, days later. I don't know what his intentions were, but I know one thing: I've never run that route again. It's taken me a long time to finally put this down, and even now, I'm not sure I can make sense of it. It feels strange to even talk about. I never thought something like this could happen, but it did, and I'm still not sure how to feel about it. It all started a few months ago when a new guy started working at the office. His name was Mark. I didn't think much of him at first, just another guy in the cubicles, trying to settle in. I noticed he seemed to be friendly, always asking questions, a little too eager to help. He would chat with me more than with anyone else, asking about my day, asking if I wanted coffee, offering to run small errands for me. He was nice enough, I guess, but I started feeling uncomfortable after a while. His attention was a little too much, too often. But I brushed it off, figuring I was just being paranoid. Then came the first strange thing. One day, I came into the office, and there was a small plant on my desk. Not just any plant either, a little succulent, in a ceramic pot with a handwritten note that said, "I thought this would make your day brighter." I didn't recognize the handwriting, and there was no name. I stared at it for a moment, unsure of what to do. I didn't want to sound ungrateful, but it felt odd, especially coming from someone I barely knew. Still, I thought maybe it was just a nice gesture. Maybe someone was just being friendly. Maybe I was overthinking it. The next day, another gift. A coffee mug. It wasn't the same as the plant this time. The mug was just a generic one, but it had my favorite color on it. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was too specific. But again, I didn't want to jump to conclusions, so I put the mug in my cabinet and tried to forget about it. But it didn't stop there. Over the next few weeks, it became a pattern. Little notes, small gifts, always things that felt a little too personal. A new set of pens with my initials on them. A box of chocolates with a message that said, "For your sweet smile." It was always just the right amount of thoughtfulness to seem like a nice gesture, but at the same time, it always felt off. It wasn't that I didn't appreciate kindness, I did, but the more these gifts piled up, the more I felt trapped. I never knew how to respond, or even if I should. I started to notice Mark more. He'd be standing a little too close when he talked to me. He'd give me this odd, almost vacant smile whenever I tried to step away from him. There was something about his eyes that made me feel uneasy. But he was always polite, always professional, so I tried not to make a big deal out of it. After all, I didn't want to seem rude or paranoid. Then came the first incident that really made me uncomfortable. One evening, I was leaving work a little later than usual, and as I was walking to my car, I saw Mark standing in the parking lot. I figured maybe he was just waiting for someone else or having a smoke, but then I realized he was looking directly at me. Not just glancing over, but really watching. It was unnerving. While I waved and said goodbye, he didn't wave back. He just stood there, his gaze fixed on me. I brushed it off as weird timing. Maybe he was waiting for his ride, maybe he hadn't seen me leave. But the next day, when I got to work, there was another note on my desk. I saw you leaving last night. You looked like you needed some fresh air. That was when my stomach dropped. How could he have known that unless he was watching me? I tried to laugh it off, but I couldn't. I kept telling myself I was being ridiculous, that I was just overreacting. But something was wrong. I didn't want to confront him, didn't want to make it awkward or escalate things, so I stayed quiet. But the weirdness continued. A few days later, while I was out running errands after work, I ran into him at a coffee shop. I hadn't told anyone where I was going, so the coincidence felt off. He smiled at me, a little too eagerly. I didn't know you came here, he said. I love this place. I felt my stomach twist. Yeah, it's a nice spot, I said, forcing a smile. I didn't know what to do. I was trying to be polite, but my mind was racing. Why was he here? How did he know this was where I liked to go? Things only escalated from there. Over the next couple of weeks, I started noticing him showing up in places I frequented, cafes, stores, even the gym. He never said anything when I saw him. He would just smile, wave, and act like it was the most normal thing in the world. But I was starting to get scared. It wasn't just the gifts anymore. It wasn't just the notes. It was the fact that he seemed to be following me. I tried to avoid him, taking different routes home, changing up my routine. But it didn't seem to matter. No matter where I went, Mark always seemed to be there. At first, it was easy enough to brush off as coincidence, but then I started noticing things I couldn't ignore. I came into work one morning to find a picture of myself sitting on my desk. It was a photo of me walking into a store the day before. He had taken it from a distance, but it was definitely me. There was a note attached. I like the way you dress. You always look so nice. That was the breaking point for me. I couldn't take it anymore. I didn't feel safe. I didn't feel like I could trust anyone anymore, not even the people I worked with. I'd spent weeks trying to figure out how to handle it, but this was too much. I couldn't ignore the signs anymore. I went to my manager and told her everything. I showed her the pictures, the notes, the gifts. She was surprised, shocked even. She had no idea anything was going on. But I knew something had to be done. We decided to report it to HR, who in turn contacted the security team and said they would look into it. Mark was called into the office for a meeting the next day. And after that, he was never seen again. No one ever said what happened. There was no explanation, no word about whether he was let go or if there were any consequences. All I know is that he was gone, and the gifts stopped. The notes stopped. But I still feel uneasy sometimes. I still wonder if he's out there, watching me. It's hard to shake that feeling. I don't know what he wanted, and I don't know why he chose me. But I know I never want to go through something like that again. I don't think anyone should ever have to. It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend getaway, a chance for the group to escape the noise of city life and get back to nature. There were 5 of us, me, my brother, his girlfriend, my best friend, and her cousin. Nothing special, just a weekend hike into some remote area. We'd been planning it for months, picking out a spot we thought would be quiet and secluded. None of us were expecting anything to go wrong. We were just looking forward to some time by the fire, some good food, and maybe a few hikes through the woods. The first day went off without a hitch. We set up camp at a small clearing near a creek, made a fire, and spent the evening talking, cooking dinner, and drinking a little. The place was perfect, quiet, private, just far enough off the trail to feel like we were really away from everything. The forest felt peaceful, even a little magical. At least, that's how I saw it then. But things started to feel off on the second day. We woke up to the sound of birds, but there was something wrong with the quiet. It wasn't the usual kind of quiet you expect in nature, or it's just peaceful and calm. It felt too still, like the air was holding its breath. Still, we brushed it off, made some breakfast, and headed out for a hike. It was a long walk, more than we had planned, but none of us really cared. We were all in good spirits, just enjoying the fresh air. When we got back to camp around late afternoon, something felt strange. The whole area around the clearing seemed dark, even though it was still light outside. I couldn't put my finger on it, but I just felt uneasy. We went about setting up for dinner, but it was hard to shake the feeling. Maybe it was just the tiredness setting in. After we ate, my brother and I decided to take a walk to stretch our legs and clear our heads. The rest of the group stayed by the fire, talking and laughing. It was just a short walk, down the trail that led back to the road where we parked. We weren't going to leave camp, just wander a little to get some fresh air. That's when we saw it. About half a mile down the trail, right where the road met the wooded area, there was a gate, rusted, heavy, and completely out of place. It was blocking the path, completely shutting off the only way out. We both stopped dead in our tracks when we saw it. It wasn't there when we first arrived, not even close. We had walked down this same path that morning, and there had been nothing. The road was wide open, just like it should be. But now, in front of us, was a tall, metal gate that looked like it had been there for decades. I thought it was some sort of private property gate, maybe someone who lived nearby had put it up. My brother suggested it was an old hunting camp or a ranch that used to be around, but I didn't buy it. Something about it didn't feel right. It was too deliberate, like it had been placed there specifically to block us in. We tried to push on the gate, but it was locked, and there were no signs, no markings, nothing to explain why it was there. We've looked around for any kind of indication of who might own it, but the woods were completely silent. No houses, no roads, nothing. Just the endless trees on all sides. After a few minutes of trying to figure out how to get through, we decided to head back to camp and tell the others. As we walked back, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The woods around us seemed so quiet, but I kept hearing small sounds, branches cracking, the rustle of leaves. I couldn't see anything, but it felt like something was just out of view, lurking. When we got back to the campsite, we told the others about the gate. At first, they didn't believe us. They thought it was some kind of mistake, or maybe a prank. But when we walked them down the trail to show them, the gate was still there. We all stood there for a moment, staring at it, trying to make sense of it. The sunlight was fading fast, and the whole place suddenly felt darker, colder. None of us really knew what to do. We had no way of contacting anyone since we didn't have cell service, and the gate was the only way out. We couldn't just stay here forever. So, We all decided to sleep on it and figure things out in the morning. We made sure to lock up the tent and keep the fire going, but no one felt at ease. Everyone kept glancing at the gate, the darkening woods beyond, like they were expecting something to happen. That night, I couldn't sleep. The sounds in the woods outside the tent were off, almost like something or someone was moving around. I kept hearing footsteps, faint at first, then closer. I thought maybe it was just an animal, but then I realized that these footsteps didn't sound like they were coming from the usual direction. They were too slow, too deliberate. And they seemed to stop when I tried to listen more closely, as if someone was standing perfectly still, waiting for me to look. I tried to shake it off, but I couldn't. Every time I almost drifted off, I'd hear them again, just outside the tent. I got up to check the fire, but it was still going strong. No one else was awake. Everything was quiet again, but I felt it. There was something wrong. In the morning, we packed up our things, trying to figure out what to do. We couldn't just leave the way we came. The gate was still there, locked in place. And there was no way around it. The road behind us was blocked by a thick wall of trees, with no visible way through. We debated for a while on whether to try climbing the gate, but it was too high, and there was no way to know who might be on the other side. After a few hours, we finally made the decision to head deeper into the woods, hoping we could find another way out. But when we turned back onto the main trail, we were met with something even worse. The gate wasn't the only thing blocking us anymore. The whole trail seemed to have been altered, like someone or something had intentionally moved things to keep us from leaving. Rocks were piled up, branches were snapped and laid across the path, and the trees themselves seemed to loom closer, more menacing. I'm not sure how to explain it, but there was no mistaking it. We were being trapped. That's when we realized that someone, or something, didn't want us to leave. The whole experience was so unsettling, and it was clear that we weren't just dealing with a simple gate that had been put up for some unknown reason. Whoever or whatever was out there was making sure we stayed put. We never found out who was behind it all. After hours of wandering the woods, trying every possible path, we managed to find a back trail that led us to a neighboring road. We made it out, but the whole time, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching us, waiting for us to slip up. Every sound, every crack of a twig, every rustle in the trees made my heart race. I don't know if we were just unlucky or if it was something more, but I'll never forget that locked gate or the feeling of being trapped out there, helpless, with no idea who or what was keeping us from leaving. And I'll never go back to that place again. It was supposed to be a normal evening. I had just gotten off work, the rain was coming down heavy, and I was in a rush to get home. I don't even remember why, but I needed to get out of there quickly. I had parked at the bottom of a steep hill in the city, right near an old apartment building with this narrow, slippery staircase leading up to the street. The kind of staircase you walk down when you're rushing, hoping not to slip and fall. I wasn't paying enough attention, honestly. My mind was all over the place, thinking about work, about the drive home, about what I still had to do. It was dark, the street lamps were flickering in the rain, and I couldn't even see clearly. I stepped onto the first stair, and that's when I felt the slickness beneath my foot. Before I knew it, my foot shot out from under me. I tried to catch myself, but the next thing I knew, I was tumbling down the rest of the stairs. My body hit every step like a sack of potatoes. I heard the sickening thud of my head hitting the stone, the way it bounced off the wet steps. My arms and legs felt like they were made of rubber, and I was too disoriented to make sense of what was happening. I think I lost consciousness for a second. I remember seeing flashes of light and hearing distant noises before everything went black. When I came to, I was lying on my back, soaked from head to toe, the cold rain splashing in my face. I could barely move. My whole body felt like it had been hit by a truck. The taste of blood was in my mouth, and I couldn't remember where I was or how long I'd been out. My head was pounding. Slowly, I blinked a few times, trying to focus. That's when I noticed them. There were people standing around me, looking down at me. I tried to lift my head, but my neck was stiff, and I could barely keep my eyes open. They weren't rushing to help me. They weren't even concerned about the fact that I had just fallen down the stairs and might be seriously hurt. They just stared at me. The first thing I noticed was the guy closest to me. He was wearing a rain-soaked jacket, his hood pulled up over his head. His face was partially hidden, but I could see his eyes were darting around nervously, like he was expecting something or someone to show up. There were two others standing behind him, one tall and thin, the other short with a thick coat. Neither of them said anything, but they were watching me intently. The guy closest to me kneeled down. "Hey, you all right?" His voice wasn't kind. It wasn't concerned. It was flat, almost bored. I tried to speak, but my mouth felt numb, like I was drunk. I couldn't make a sound. I just lay there, unable to move, feeling the cold rain against my skin, and the pain in my head. The guy didn't seem to care. He reached into my pocket without warning, and before I could even react, he pulled out my wallet. I tried to sit up. My body screamed at me to stop, but I pushed through the pain, my head spinning, trying to focus on what was happening. "Hey," I managed to croak, "give it back." The guy didn't even look up at me. He opened my wallet and started flipping through it. I could barely see, but I noticed my credit cards, my ID, everything. My breath was shallow. I knew something wasn't right. These people weren't here to help me. They didn't care about the fact that I had just fallen down a flight of stairs in the rain. They cared about my wallet. "Hey," I said, "give it back," I repeated, my voice shaking with anger and fear. My fingers were still stiff, but I managed to move one hand, weakly reaching out to grab my wallet. The tall guy behind him, who hadn't spoken a word until then, stepped forward. He had a sharp look in his eyes, and his face was completely expressionless. He reached out, pushing my hand away with a little more force than I expected. "Stay down," he said, his voice cold. I tried to protest, but my head throbbed, and the world spun around me. Everything felt distant, like I wasn't even in my own body. I just kept watching them, struggling to make sense of what was happening. They weren't trying to help. They weren't trying to call for an ambulance or ask if I was okay. They were just waiting, watching me suffer. The guy with my wallet, who had been rifling through it, suddenly pulled out my cash. I could barely keep my eyes open, but I saw him slide the bills into his jacket pocket with a sly grin on his face. Then, he dropped the wallet back onto my chest like it was nothing. "You should have been more careful," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Not a good idea to be out here all alone in the rain, huh?" I couldn't believe what was happening. I tried to push myself up, but I was still too disoriented. My arms were shaky. I wanted to fight back, but my body wasn't working right. My legs felt like they were made of stone. All I could do was watch them. The tall guy crouched next to me, looking down at me with a strange expression. I couldn't tell if he was amused or annoyed. "You should just stay still," he said, his voice low. "Don't make this harder than it has to be." The short guy, who had been standing quietly until then, started moving around, like he was looking for something. He went through my car, checking the doors, peering inside like he was searching for more things to steal. The rain was coming down harder now, but these guys didn't seem to care at all. I was terrified, feeling helpless and trapped. There were 3 of them, and I was alone on this dark, rainy street, barely able to move. I couldn't think straight, but I knew I had to get away, somehow. I had to make it stop. I started shouting, my voice cracking. "Call the police." I screamed, but it came out as barely a whisper. They just looked at each other, like they were deciding what to do with me next. My heart raced, and panic began to set in. Finally, the guy who had been rummaging through my stuff stood up. He took one last look at me before stepping back, pulling something out of his pocket. I couldn't make out what it was at first, but when I saw the glint of a knife, my stomach turned. I didn't know if he was going to use it on me or just threaten me, but I didn't want to find out. I heard the man mutter something, but it was lost in the roar of the rain. I couldn't stay there. I had to get up. I had to move. Using every ounce of strength I had left, I pushed myself off the wet ground. My legs were still weak, but I stumbled, managing to get to my feet. They watched me, but none of them moved. I could hear my heart pounding in my ears. I backed up, slowly, toward my car. They didn't stop me. I fumbled for my keys, my hands shaking as I unlocked the door and threw myself inside. I slammed the door shut, my hands still trembling, and I sped off without looking back. I don't know why they didn't follow me, or why they didn't do anything else, but I didn't stop until I was out of that area and into the nearest gas station, where I stayed inside, my hands still shaking. I'm still not sure what they wanted. All I know is they weren't there to help me. They just wanted my wallet. It happened during a layover. I had a few hours to kill before my next flight, so I was just hanging around the airport, trying to pass the time. I'd been traveling for what felt like forever, and my head was starting to ache from the combination of exhaustion and the constant noise of the terminal. I wasn't in the best mood, but it wasn't a big deal. I figured I'd just sit and wait for my boarding time. I found an empty seat by one of the gates, just far enough from the crowd so I could have a little peace. I pulled out my phone, started scrolling through emails and news, trying to distract myself. About an hour passed like that, nothing eventful. I didn't even notice a man sitting down next to me at first. He seemed normal enough. He smiled and said, "Looks like you've got a while to wait." I nodded. "Yeah, just telling time." I didn't expect much from the conversation, but I wasn't in a rush to be rude either. He introduced himself as Tim. He was wearing a business suit, probably in his late 30s, with short, neatly combed hair. He seemed friendly, nothing off about him. He was just another traveler, like me. He told me he had just come back from a business trip and was waiting for his connecting flight. We chatted a little about where we were both headed, and I assumed it was just small talk to pass the time. Then, after a few minutes, he asked if I'd ever been to the city we were both flying into. I told him I hadn't, but that I was excited to check it out. That's when he leaned in a bit, lowered his voice, and said something that caught me off guard. "You know, if you need help with directions, I've got some great local tips. I've been to that city a few times, and I know a guy who can really help you out. He's the best driver in town, doesn't charge too much, and he can show you all the best spots. It's nice to have someone who knows the area, especially when you're traveling alone." I thought it was a bit strange, but it wasn't like I hadn't heard similar things before. People in airports were always offering advice, and I didn't think much of it. I thanked him and said I'd probably just take a taxi from the airport. But Tim wouldn't let it go. He kept talking about how much easier it would be to get around if I used his guy, how much cheaper it would be than a regular taxi, and how much more reliable the service was. He even said that if I didn't mind waiting a bit, he'd make a call for me and set it up. I was starting to feel a little uncomfortable. I wasn't sure why, but something about the whole situation didn't sit right with me. The way he kept insisting, the fact that he was almost too eager. But I figured I was just overthinking it. I'd been traveling for hours, my mind was foggy. "All right," I said. "Maybe I'll take you up on that. But I'll let you know if I change my mind." Tim smiled, and that's when things started to shift in a way I couldn't quite put my finger on. It wasn't a bad smile, exactly, but it was too smooth, too practiced. "No problem," he said. "I'll just go make the call and we'll get you all set up. It'll be easier for you, trust me." I watched as he stood up and walked toward the back of the terminal, dialing something on his phone. I didn't think much of it, still half distracted by my own thoughts. A few minutes later, he returned, looking pleased. "It's all set," he said. "The driver will meet you right by the exit. He's expecting you, so you won't have to wait around." I felt a twinge of doubt but told myself it was fine. It was just a ride. I was being paranoid. Tim seemed nice enough. I thanked him, and he said it was no trouble, just doing a favor for a fellow traveler. I followed him to the exit of the airport, where I saw a man standing by a car. He was wearing dark sunglasses, even though it was still light outside, and he was holding a sign with my name on it. It all seemed so normal, so official, that I almost didn't question it. But something nagged at me. Tim stood there, watching me, his hands in his pockets, like he was waiting for something. "There he is," Tim said, his voice too calm. "You'll be in good hands." I hesitated for a moment, but the man with the sign smiled at me and waved. I walked up to him, told him my name, and he nodded. "Right this way," he said, opening the back door of the car. I was about to climb in when I noticed something odd. There was a faint smell inside the car, something like stale air mixed with cleaning chemicals. And the car wasn't a typical taxi, it looked more like a private vehicle, older, and there were no obvious markings. That's when I heard Tim's voice behind me, still too calm, still a little too eager. "Don't worry," he said. "This is the best way to go. You'll get there much faster, and you won't have to deal with the hassle of the airport." I froze. Something clicked. A thought flashed through my mind. This wasn't White. There was no reason for him to be so invested in my ride. There was no reason for him to be pushing this so hard. I quickly turned around and walked away from the car. The man with the sign started to follow me, and that's when I realized how wrong everything felt. Tim stayed by the door of the car, his eyes watching me intently. I didn't know what to do, but I knew I had to get away. I ran back inside the terminal, looking around for security, for someone who might help. The man with the sign didn't follow me, but Tim did. He was walking toward me, his expression hardening, no longer friendly. I made my way to the nearest gate, where a security guard was standing. I went up to him, explained everything as best I could, and showed him the man's picture on my phone. He looked at me like I was crazy, but when I pointed out that the situation didn't feel right, he called for backup. Turns out, the whole thing was a scam. Tim wasn't a fellow traveler, and the driver wasn't really a driver. They were part of a group that targeted people with long layovers, offering them rides that were just a setup for robbery or worse. They had a whole operation going, luring unsuspecting people with offers of cheap, convenient transportation. I never found out how far they would have gone if I'd gotten in that car, but I'm sure it wouldn't have ended well. I'm just glad I walked away in time. The rest of my layover was spent in a corner of the terminal, surrounded by security. When I finally boarded my flight, I could still feel the tension in my chest, the creeping feeling that I'd narrowly escaped something much worse. I won't be trusting strangers in airports again. Not ever. I used to work as a delivery driver for a company that handled large shipments. Most of the time, it was easy work: pick up the package, drop it off, get a signature, and move on to the next stop. The night it happened, I had one last delivery on my route. The warehouse was way out of town, on an industrial road that was mostly empty. I'd been there a few times before. The place was always quiet, just a few guys working late shifts, unloading trucks or organizing pallets. The package I was delivering wasn't unusual. Just a long, rectangular crate about 6 feet tall. The thing that stuck out was the weight. It was heavier than anything I'd moved that week. I had to use the dolly to get it onto the truck, and when I stopped at the warehouse, it took all my strength to roll it to the loading dock. The dock door was open when I arrived, but the lights inside were dim. I called out, but no one answered at first. After a minute, a guy came around the corner. He looked rough, like he hadn't slept in days, dark circles under his eyes, stubble on his face. He wasn't wearing any uniform, just a plain jacket and jeans. "You're late," he said, not looking at me. I told him I had other stops, but he didn't seem to care. He just pointed to the crate and said, "Bring it in." I pushed the dolly into the warehouse. It was colder inside than I expected, and it smelled bad, like chemicals and something rotting. The guy led me to a corner where a few more men were standing. There were 4 of them total, all dressed the same, jackets, work boots, no uniforms. They didn't say much, just nodded at the crate and motioned for me to leave it there. One of them handed me a clipboard to sign. I noticed his hands were dirty, like he'd been working with oil or grease, but there was something else on them too. Something darker. It wasn't grease, it looked like blood. I signed the paperwork and turned to leave, but one of the men stepped in front of me. He was taller than the others, with a shaved head and a thick scar running down his cheek. He didn't say anything, just stared at me. "I need to get going," I said, trying to sound calm. He didn't move. The guy who had met me at the dock walked over and put a hand on my shoulder. "We need you to wait a minute," he said. I told them I couldn't stay, that I had to finish my shift, but they didn't care. The man with the scar grabbed my arm and led me toward the back of a warehouse. I tried to pull away, but his grip was like a vice. "Just a minute," he said. "We need to check something." I didn't know what they meant, but the way they were acting made my stomach twist. They led me to a small office at the back of a building. The windows were covered with blinds, and the only light came from a flickering fluorescent bulb. "Sit," the guy with the scar said, pointing to a metal chair in the middle of the room. I sat. My hands were sweating, and my heart was racing. They stood around me, blocking the door. The guy who had handed me the clipboard opened a crate. I couldn't see what was inside from where I was sitting, but the others leaned in, murmuring to each other. "What's going on?" I asked. They didn't answer. One of them, a younger guy with a nervous look on his face, glanced at me and then quickly looked away. The man with the scar closed the crate and walked over to me. "Where did you pick this up?" he asked. I told him the address. He nodded but didn't say anything else. The room was so quiet I could hear the hum of the light above us. Then he leaned down, his face inches from mine. "Did you open it?" I shook my head. "No. I just picked it up like I was told." He stared at me for a long moment, then straightened up. "Good. Stay here." The 4 of them left the room, locking the door behind them. I stood up and tried the handle, but it wouldn't budge. I pounded on the door, yelling for them to let me out, but no one came. I didn't know how long I was in there, but it felt like hours. I could hear faint voices outside, but I couldn't make out what they were saying. Then I heard something else, something heavy being dragged across the floor. I looked around the room, trying to find something to defend myself with, but there was nothing. Just the chair, the desk, and a filing cabinet. I opened the drawers, but they were empty. The door finally opened, and the guy with the scar came back in. He had something in his hand, a long, thin knife. My throat went dry. "You shouldn't have come here," he said. "I was just doing my job," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. He stepped closer, holding the knife at his side. "Sometimes people see things they shouldn't." "Sure, things they shouldn't." I backed up until I hit the wall. "I didn't see anything. I swear." He tilted his head, like he was considering my words. Then he smiled, a cold, humorless smile that made my skin crawl. "You're going to help us clean up," he said. I didn't understand what he meant until he grabbed my arm and pulled me out of the room. The other 3 men were standing by the crate, which was now lying on its side. Something was sticking out of it, a piece of fabric, dark and stained. "Get rid of it," the man with the scar said to the others. One of them hesitated. "What about him?" he asked, nodding toward me. The scarred man looked at me, his expression unreadable. "He's going to help." They handed me a tarp and a roll of duct tape. I didn't want to take them, but I didn't have a choice. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold onto them. They opened the crate fully, and I saw what was inside. I won't describe it. I can't. All I'll say is that it was worse than anything I'd ever imagined. "We don't have all night," one of them snapped. I don't know how I got through it. I just did what they told me, trying not to think about what I was doing, about what I'd seen. When we were done, they loaded everything into a truck parked behind the warehouse. "Now leave," the man with the scar said, shoving me toward the door. I didn't wait. I ran to my truck and drove as fast as I could, not stopping until I was miles away. I didn't go to the police. I didn't tell anyone. I just quit my job and tried to forget. But I can't. Every time I close my eyes, I see that crate. And I know they're still out there. It was a Saturday morning when my fiancée and I decided to go check out this house we found online. The listing looked great, spacious, affordable, and in a decent area. We had been looking for a while, and everything about this house seemed perfect. The listing photos were all bright, airy rooms, and the backyard was exactly what we wanted. I was excited, and my fiancée, Sarah, was too. We were getting serious about settling down, and this place could be the one. We arrived at the address a little early, parked, and waited in the car for a few minutes. It wasn't a very busy area. Just a quiet street with houses spaced out, a little too quiet for my taste, but it didn't bother me. We went up to the front door, and I rang the bell. I looked around while we waited for the realtor. The house itself was nice from the outside, big, with a porch, a 2-car garage. A couple of bushes near the front door, a few trees around the yard. The kind of house you could see yourself living in. The door opened after a few moments, but no one was there. I thought maybe the realtor had just been in the back, getting ready or something. I stepped forward and looked inside. The house was dark inside. There were no lights on, but the door was open just wide enough for me to see the hallway. I called out, "Hello?" No answer. I looked at Sarah, who was standing next to me. "Maybe we're early," she suggested. I shrugged. "Could be. I'll wait a couple minutes." We both stood there in the silence, waiting for someone to come to the door. But after another minute or so, I started to get the feeling something wasn't quite right. It wasn't like the place was abandoned. The door was unlocked, but the house still had furniture in it, like it was ready for showings. I was about to turn around and call the real estate agency when I heard a noise inside, faint footsteps, like someone moving in the other room. "Hello?" I called again, a little louder this time. Nothing. I pushed the door open slightly and peeked inside. The house was old, but clean, well maintained. There were a few pieces of furniture scattered around the couch here, a coffee table there, but it looked like it had been staged for a showing. Nothing too personal or too lived in. Just the bare essentials to make it look homey. But still, it felt off. I stepped inside and looked around. The air smelled faintly of something sweet, like cinnamon, but it felt stale, almost like no one had been in the house for a while. I glanced over at Sarah, who was still standing by the door, looking hesitant. "We should go back to the car and call the agency," Sarah said, looking uneasy. "Maybe they forgot about the appointment." Before I could respond, I heard it again, the soft sound of footsteps, coming from upstairs this time. "Did you hear that?" I asked, turning to Sarah. She nodded, wide-eyed. "I'm not going upstairs alone," she said, voice trembling. "Neither am I replied. But wasn't sure what to do next. We could leave, but something about the situation had me frozen, like I couldn't quite put my finger on why it felt wrong, but it did. We both stood there, not moving, until I heard the footsteps again. This time they were louder, more deliberate. And then, they stopped. I swallowed hard. "I think we should check it out." "What?" Sarah said, staring at me like I had lost my mind. "I don't know," I said, my voice shaky. I feel like we should see what's going on." Sarah looked at me for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "All right. But I'm not going first." We cautiously made our way toward the stairs. I didn't know I was expecting, but I kept waiting for someone to step out, for a realtor to greet us or for someone to explain the situation. When we reached the top of the stairs, we were hit by a strong smell, something metallic. Almost like blood. I gagged at the scent, but tried to ignore it. At the top of the stairs, there were 2 doors. One was closed, but the other was slightly ajar. I pushed it open slowly, holding my breath. Why, sound made my stomach drop. The room was set up like a normal bedroom, except it wasn't. There were strange marks on the floor, like something heavy had been dragged across it. A large rug was pulled to the side, revealing a section of the floor that had been scratched up. My heart was racing now, and I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I heard a noise from behind me and turned. Sarah was still standing in the hallway, but she looked pale. I took a step back toward her. "We need to leave now," I said. But as I turned to go, my foot caught on something. I looked down, and that's when I saw it, a small piece of rope. It was thin, but strong. The kind of rope he'd used to tie something up. I pulled on it, and the floorboard beneath me creaked, like something was being dragged under it. I felt like I was suffocating. "This is all wrong," I muttered. I backed away from the room and turned to Sarah. "We need to call the police. This place it's a trap." As I started toward the stairs, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The door to the master bedroom was open, and the closet door was hanging half off its hinges. Inside, I could see the faint outline of a bag, but it wasn't just any bag, it was a large, heavy-duty duffel bag. My heart pounded, and my instinct screamed at me to run. "We need to get out of here, now," I whispered to Sarah, grabbing her by the arm and pulling her toward the stairs. As we rushed toward the front door, I glanced back at the living room. The house was eerily silent. No sign of anyone. But the feeling that we weren't alone lingered. We got to the front door, But just as I reached for the handle, the door slammed shut. I turned to Sarah, panic setting in. What the hell? The sound of footsteps echoed from upstairs. Heavy, deliberate. Someone was coming. I didn't wait. I grabbed the handle again and yanked as hard as I could, throwing open the door. We ran out of the house and didn't look back. We didn't stop until we were in the car, and I drove as fast as I could, not saying a word. When we got to the nearest police station, we told them everything. They sent a team to check the house, but by the time they arrived, the place was completely empty. No sign of anyone. They told us there were no records of a house being on the market at all. The agency we contacted, they said they had no idea who the realtor was. It was as if everything about the house had been fabricated. I don't know who set that trap, or what they were planning to do, but I know one thing for sure: we were lucky to get out of there alive. I still can't shake the feeling. The cold, wet air. The sound of my own breath mixed with the pounding rain. And that feeling of someone watching, someone just behind me, every step of the way. It started like any other run. I was out on my usual route, the kind of run I do when I need to clear my head. The rain had been coming down hard all day, and I wasn't about to let that stop me. I had my hood up, my shoes splashing through the puddles, and the rhythmic sound of my footsteps in my ears. The world felt distant, the streets quieter than usual, the kind of night where everything seems muffled by the storm. It wasn't until I was about halfway through that I noticed it. At first, I thought it was just the noise of the rain, maybe some stray footsteps from someone else running nearby. But then I realized the footsteps were too close, too in sync with mine. I tried to ignore it, told myself it was just my imagination, but it didn't stop. Every time I picked up the pace, the footsteps behind me quickened. Every time I slowed down, they slowed too. I glanced over my shoulder once, quickly, just to see if anyone was there. Nothing. Just the rain, the street lights reflecting off the wet pavement. But when I turned my head back, I could hear it again, the footsteps, still right behind me. I could feel my heart starting to race, the anxiety creeping up in my chest. Who would be out here in this weather, running so close? I sped up, thinking maybe I was just paranoid, but they kept matching my pace. The sound of those steps, heavy, deliberate, was starting to make my skin crawl. I had to stop. I needed to see who it was, to confront them. If someone was behind me, they were clearly following me, and I wasn't about to be caught unaware. I turned sharply to the side, slipping slightly on the wet pavement as I came to a stop, but still keeping my eyes on the street behind me. My breath was coming out in clouds, but I couldn't stop looking, couldn't stop listening. For a moment, I heard nothing. No footsteps, no movement. The rain kept falling, louder now, the only sound in the empty street. Then I heard it again. The footsteps. But this time, they were closer. I tensed, standing there in the rain, just waiting. My nerves were shot, every muscle in my body screaming for me to either run or confront whoever it was. I chose to turn around and face whatever was coming. And there he was. A man, just a few feet away, standing in the rain, looking at me with this intense, unsettling stare. I couldn't see much of his face. He had a dark hoodie pulled up over his head, the fabric soaked through. His hands were shoved deep into the pockets of his jacket, but I could tell his posture was stiff, almost like he was waiting for something. I took a breath, trying to stay calm. "You following me?" I asked, my voice shaky but firm. The man didn't answer at first. He just stood there, staring at me. I felt the tension between us building, something in the air thickening with the promise of something bad. My pulse was racing, and I could feel my legs starting to shake. But I wasn't about to let him see that. Finally, he spoke. His voice was low, almost a growl. "You're in my way." I didn't know what he meant by that. I didn't know if he was talking about the street or something else, but his tone was all wrong. There was no reason for him to be this close, this intense. I didn't know if he was threatening me or just crazy, but I knew I had to get out of there. I took a step back, trying to put some space between us. "I'm just running. I don't want any trouble," I said, keeping my voice as calm as I could, though inside, I was panicky. The man didn't move. He just stood there, still staring at me. And then, before I could even think, he took a step forward. It was sudden, fast, and without warning. I froze, my feet rooted to the wet pavement. "What do you want?" I demanded, louder now, more desperate. I had to keep control. I had to. I wasn't about to get caught in this situation. But as I stepped back again, he took another step closer, closing the distance between us. The man's eyes narrowed. "I'm not done with you," he said, each word dripping with something dark, something threatening. I turned and ran. I didn't think about it, didn't hesitate for a second. I bolted down the street, heart pounding in my chest, every step faster than the last. The sound of the rain in my ears, the sloshing of my shoes in the puddles, none of it mattered. I couldn't hear anything but my own frantic breath and those footsteps, now echoing in time with mine. He was still behind me. I could hear him gaining on me. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I could feel his presence, like he was inches away, waiting for the right moment to grab me. The rain was coming down harder now, a plur of water, and I could barely see. My legs burned with the effort, but I couldn't stop. Not now. Now I had no idea what this man wanted or how far he was willing to go. I turned down a side street, hoping to lose him, hoping he would just give up and turn away. But the footsteps didn't stop. They were right there. Closer now. I didn't know what he would do when he caught me. I didn't want to find out. I spotted a row of houses up ahead, the lights from the windows offering a glimmer of safety. I pushed myself harder, humping my legs, not daring to slow down. I was almost there. I was almost safe. Then, just as I reached the sidewalk near the houses, the footsteps stopped. The sound of them, the heavy, deliberate steps, just cut off. For a second, I thought maybe he had given up. I didn't want to risk looking back, but something told me that it was too quiet now. Too still. I slowed my pace, but I didn't stop. I kept walking, the anxiety still crawling under my skin, the feeling of being hunted lingering in the air. And just as I was about to turn the corner, I heard the voice again. Low. Menacing. "You can't run forever." I didn't stop running until I was inside the first house I found, knocking frantically on the door, not even caring if I looked crazy. When the door opened, I practically collapsed, still shaking, still drenched from the rain. The woman who answered looked at me in confusion, but when I explained what had happened, she let me in without a word. I don't know how I made it through the rest of the night, but I did. I never saw the man again. But I can't stop thinking about him, about the way he followed me, about the way he spoke, like it wasn't just about running anymore. I don't know if he was just trying to scare me or if he had something worse planned. But the whole night feels like a blur, just the sound of rain and footsteps, and his voice. I haven't gone for a run since. I thought about telling this story for a while now, but every time I try, I can't quite get the words right. I'm not a writer, and I don't think I ever will be. But I feel like I have to get it out. Someone should know what happened. Why I saw. Why I felt. I went camping with a few friends last summer. It was supposed to be a simple trip, nothing fancy. A weekend to unwind in the mountains, escape the noise of the city. We set up camp near a river, not too far from a well-known trail, but far enough that we wouldn't have to deal with other hikers. Everything seemed perfect at first. The weather was nice, the air was fresh, and the only sounds were the river and the birds. We had a good time. A few hikes, some fishing, a campfire. It was nice. But on the third day, things started to go wrong. We had planned to go for a long hike. The others wanted to explore a bit further, up into the hills. I didn't want to go at first, but I decided to tag along. I figured it would be nice to get away from the camp for a bit and stretch my legs. So we packed some water, snacks, and set off early in the morning. The hike was more difficult than I expected. The path wasn't as clear as I thought it would be, and the terrain got rough pretty quickly. But the view was beautiful. We stopped at a few overlooks, took some pictures, and then started heading back down. I didn't think it would be that hard to find our way back to camp. But by the time we turned around to head back, I realized I had gotten turned around. I wasn't sure which direction we had come from. I thought I remembered the trail, but everything started to look the same. I didn't want to admit I was lost, so I kept walking, thinking I'd find the way back soon enough. The others were ahead of me, but I wasn't too worried. I thought I'd catch up. The deeper into the woods I went, the more everything seemed unfamiliar. The path was less visible now, overgrown in spots, and I couldn't hear the river anymore. I stopped and tried to get my bearings, but I couldn't make out anything that looked familiar. I should have turned back right then, but I didn't. I kept going. After what felt like hours, I noticed something strange. There was a small clearing ahead. The ground was trampled, the grass bent, and there were footprints. They didn't look like animal prints. They were too large, too uneven. As I got closer, I saw something that made my stomach drop. A pile of broken branches, stacked in a way that didn't seem natural. It looked like someone had been trying to build something. But there was no sign of anyone around. I felt a knot form in my stomach, and I tried to turn around, but that's when I heard it. A rustling sound, like someone was moving through the trees. It was faint, but it was there. My heart started to race, and I held my breath, straining to listen. There was no one else on the trail. I knew that. I hadn't seen anyone else the whole time we'd been out here. And yet, I could feel something watching me. I backed away slowly, trying not to make a sound, but it felt like the woods were closing in on me. The rustling grew louder, and then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. Complete silence. I didn't wait around to figure out what it was. I turned and started running, hoping to find the trail again. The panic started to settle in. I was lost, and I didn't know which way to go. I kept running, but it felt like the trees were getting thicker, like they were deliberately blocking my path. I could feel my chest tightening, and my legs were starting to give out. I had to stop for a minute, catch my breath. That's when I noticed something else. There were markings on the trees. At first, I thought they were just scratches, maybe from animals, but the more I looked, the more I realized they weren't. They were deliberate. A series of notches, almost like someone was marking their territory. But it didn't make sense. There shouldn't have been anyone out here. Not this deep in the woods. Not this far from the trail. I was about to turn around when I heard a voice. It was quiet at first, barely a whisper, like someone calling my name. but it wasn't anyone I recognized. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The voice didn't sound friendly. It sounded urgent. Like it didn't want me to leave. I started to back away, but the ground under me shifted, and I lost my balance. I fell, landing hard on the ground. When I looked up, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A figure. A man. He was standing between the trees, watching me. He was tall, but he wasn't moving. I couldn't make out his face clearly, it was covered in shadow, but I could tell he was staring at me. It was like he had been waiting for me. I couldn't breathe. My whole body went rigid, and I didn't know what to do. I couldn't speak. I couldn't move. Then, just as quickly as he appeared, he disappeared into the trees. Vanished. Like he wasn't even there. I stayed frozen on the ground for a long time, trying to process what just happened. Was he real? Or was it my mind playing tricks on me? I didn't know. But I didn't care. I wasn't staying to find out. I got up as fast as I could and started running again. I didn't stop until I found the trail. By the time I made it back to camp, I was exhausted, covered in sweat, and my mind was racing. I didn't tell anyone what happened, not right away. I couldn't bring myself to say it. It was too insane. Too unreal. But that night, as I sat by the fire, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. I didn't sleep much. Every noise in the woods felt like a threat, and I kept expecting to see that man again. I didn't say anything to the others. They were just glad to see me back. We left the next day. I didn't tell them about the figure I saw or the strange markings on the trees. I couldn't. I didn't want to make it worse. But I still think about it. The man in the woods. The feeling of being watched. The strange markings. I don't know who or what was out there, but I know I never want to find out again. It started out as a dumb idea. My friends dared me to hide out in the department store after closing. They said I wouldn't last an hour alone after the lights went off. We'd been hanging out at the mall all afternoon, and by the time we came up with the plan, it was almost closing time. They left before the staff started their final rounds, leaving me alone to figure out how to stay unnoticed. I found a spot behind a rack of winter coats in the men's section. It wasn't perfect, but it was quiet, and the coats hum low enough to block me from sight. I crouched there, waiting, listening as the last announcements play overhead and the store got quieter. Eventually, I heard the sound of the security gates rolling down at the entrances. When everything was silent, I crawled out. The store looked strange in the dark, all shadows and empty aisles. It wasn't scary, not yet. Mostly, it felt like I'd stepped into another world. I walked through the aisles, trying not to make too much noise. My plan was to stay for a couple of hours, take a few pictures to prove I'd done it, and then sneak out when the gates reopen in the morning. I headed to the electronics section first. The TV displays were off, but a few laptops were still on, their screens casting faint blue light. I took out my phone to record a video, whispering into the mic about how I was all alone. That's when I heard the first noise, a sharp, metallic clink, like a door handle being turned. I froze, holding my breath, and looked around. Nothing moved. The sound didn't come again, so I told myself it was just part of the store settling. I kept walking, heading toward the toy section. That's when I saw the flashlight. It was faint at first, a beam of light sweeping across the floor on the far side of the store. My stomach dropped. I hadn't thought about security. I figured they'd just lock the doors and leave, maybe check the cameras once in a while. But someone was definitely inside, moving through the aisles. I ducked behind a shelf and tried to think. If they caught me, I'd be in trouble. Maybe not arrested, but definitely banned from the mall, and my parents would kill me. I decided to wait until the light passed and then find a better hiding spot until the person left. But the light didn't pass. It got closer. I could hear footsteps now, slow and deliberate, like whoever it was wasn't in any hurry. I crouched lower, pressing myself against the back of the shelf. The footsteps stopped, and I held my breath, listening. Then I heard a voice. "I know you're in here." It wasn't loud, but it carried through the silence at the store. The tone was flat, almost casual, but there was something off about it, something that made my skin crawl. "I saw you on the cameras," the voice continued. "Come out now, and this will be easy." I didn't move. My heart was pounding so hard I was afraid he'd hear it. I peeked through a gap in the shelves and saw the flashlight beam swinging back and forth. The man holding it was wearing a uniform, but it didn't look like the mall security I'd seen before. His shirt was too loose, untucked, and there was no badge. Just a dark shape stitched over the pocket. He walked past my aisle, the light sweeping dangerously close to where I was hiding. I stayed frozen, trying to keep my breathing as quiet as possible. After a few seconds, he moved on, but I didn't feel safe. Something about him wasn't right. When I couldn't hear his footsteps anymore, I crept out and headed toward the back of the store, where the employee-only area was. My new plan was to hide in the stockroom until morning. The store's cameras couldn't see back there, and I figured the man wouldn't bother checking. The stockroom was cold and smelled like cardboard. Rows of shelves stretched out in every direction, filled with boxes and loose items. I found a spot behind a stack of pallets and sat down, trying to calm myself. My phone buzzed in my pocket, and I pulled it out. There was a message from one of my friends. "Did you chicken out yet?" I started typing a reply when I heard the sound of a door opening nearby. The stockroom door. I shoved my phone into my pocket and scrambled deeper into the pallets, crouching low. The man's footsteps were heavier now, echoing in the quiet space. His flashlight beam cut through the gaps between the shelves, searching. He didn't say anything this time, just walked slowly, methodically. I realized then that he wasn't looking for a thief or someone breaking the rules. He was hunting. I held my breath as the light passed over the pallets where I was hiding. It lingered for a second, then moved on. The footsteps grew fainter, and I thought he might be leaving, but then they stopped. "Do you think I won't find you?" he said. His voice was closer than I expected. "This is my place. My roles." I felt a wave of panic. I couldn't stay there. If he found me, I didn't think he'd just kick me out. There was something wrong with him, something dangerous. I waited until his light moved away, then crawled out from my hiding spot and headed toward the exit. I made it back to the sales floor without being seen. The store was even darker now, and I could barely see a few feet ahead of me. I moved as quickly as I could, trying to stay quiet. The front doors were just ahead, and I could see the faint glow of the mall's lights beyond the gates. I thought I was going to make it. Then I heard the sound of teeth jingling behind me. I turned and saw the man standing at the edge of the aisle. He wasn't shining his flashlight anymore, but I could see him clearly enough. His face was pale, his eyes wide and unblinking. He smiled, and it wasn't a friendly smile. "Leaving already?" he asked. I didn't answer. I turned and ran toward the front doors, my sneakers squeaking on the tile. I heard him running behind me, his footsteps faster now, closing the distance. When I reached the gate, I grabbed the bars and shook them, but they didn't budge. The locks were solid, and there was no way I could squeeze through. I looked around, desperate for another way out, and saw the fire exit sign glowing in the distance. I sprinted for it, my legs perny, my lungs achy. The man was still behind me, but I didn't look back. When I reached the fire exit, I slammed into the bar and pushed it open. The alarm blared, deafening, but I didn't care. I ran outside into the cold night air, my chest heaving. I didn't stop running until I was halfway across the parking lot. When I finally turned around, the man was standing in the doorway, just watching me. He didn't chase me. He just stood there, the alarm blaring behind him, until I was out of sight. I never told anyone what happened. Not my friends, not my parents. I don't even know if they would have believed me.
12:56 a.m. on 4/18.
I was sitting in the middle row of the theater, halfway through a thriller movie, when the fire alarm went off. It wasn't just a beep, it was the loud, piercing kind that makes your heart jump. The screen went dark, and the house lights flickered on. People started murmuring and looking around. No smoke, no flames, just the blaring alarm. A few ushers ran down the aisles, waving their hands and shouting for everyone to head to the exits. I grabbed my bag and followed the crowd. The main doors were a bottleneck, with everyone pushing and shoving. I decided to try the emergency exit near the screen instead. It wasn't a big crowd at the theater that night, so only a couple of others were heading that way. I figured it'd be faster. The hallway behind the emergency door was dimly lit and felt colder than it should have been. The exit sign was glowing right at the far end. I moved quickly, my sneakers squeaking on the tiled floor, but when I reached the door, it didn't budge. I pushed harder, then tried pulling. Nothing. Locked. I said aloud, my voice bouncing off the walls. I turned back and saw that the others who had followed me were already gone. Maybe they'd gone back to the main exit. I felt the unease start creeping in. The alarm was still going, muffled now by the walls. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw a man in a uniform. He came from the direction I just walked, his footsteps echoing. He looked like security, dark pants, a matching jacket, and a radio clipped to his belt. "Need help?" he asked. His voice was calm, almost too calm for the situation. "Yeah," I said. "This door's locked. Shouldn't it open during an alarm?" He stopped a few feet away, tilting his head like he was sizing me up. "Sometimes they malfunction," he said. "I can help you find another way out." I nodded, relieved. He motioned for me to follow, and I did, though something about him felt off. His uniform wasn't quite right, no patches, no name tag. His boots looked more like work boots than the kind security guards wear. As we walked, he kept glancing back at me. His eyes were dark and sharp, like he was studying me instead of the surroundings. I slowed down, letting a bit more distance grow between us. "Where are we going?" I asked. "There's another exit at the back," he said, without turning around. The hallway stretched longer than I remembered, and the lights seemed dimmer now. I didn't hear anyone else, no voices, no footsteps, just the faint hum of the alarm in the distance. "Are you sure?" I asked again. He stopped abruptly and turned to face me. His face was blank, but his eyes were intense, like he was daring me to question him again. "Do you want to get out or not?" he asked. Something in his tone made my stomach drop. I nodded but didn't move closer. He turned back around and started walking again, slower this time, like he was waiting for me to follow. I glanced over my shoulder, wondering if I should just run back the way I came, but the hallway behind me seemed darker now. I took a deep breath and followed, keeping my steps light. A few minutes later, we reached a door. He pushed it open, and I expected to see the parking lot or another part of the theater, but it was just another hallway, narrower than the last. "This doesn't feel right," I said, stopping in my tracks. He turned around again, this time with a faint smirk on his face. "You don't trust me?" I didn't answer. I glanced at his radio, wondering if it even worked. He noticed and let out a short laugh. "You think I'm not real security, huh?" he said. He stepped closer, and I stepped back. My heart was pounding now. "Where are we really going?" I asked, my voice shaky. He didn't answer. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a keyring. I didn't wait to find out what he was unlocking. I turned and bolted back down the hallway. "Hey!" he shouted, his voice echoing. I didn't look back. My legs were moving faster than they ever had, my breath coming in short gasps. The hallway felt endless, but I could see the faint glow of the exit sign in the distance. The sound of his boots pounding against the floor got louder. He was chasing me. I reached the door I tried earlier, the one that had been locked. I slammed into it, pushing with all my weight. It still didn't move. Come on," I whispered, frantically looking for a way out. His footsteps were almost on me. I turned just as he reached out, his hand grazing my arm. I ducked and slipped past him, running back the way I'd come. "Get back here," he yelled. I didn't stop. I turned a corner and saw a door with a small window. Light was streaming through it. The main lobby. I pushed through the door and stumbled into the lobby, where a group of people was gathered near the main exits. They all turned to look at me, their faces a mix of confusion and concern. "Help!" I shouted. "He's chasing me." I pointed back toward the hallway, but when I turned, the man was gone. A few ushers came over, asking me what happened. I tried to explain, but I could barely catch my breath. They called the police, and I waited with them until officers arrived. They searched the building but didn't find anyone matching the description I gave. The emergency exit door had been locked from the outside, and no one could explain why. I never went back to that theater again. It was late, later than I meant for it to be. I had been driving for hours, trying to get home from visiting my sister. The highway felt endless, and I was running on fumes literally and figuratively. When I saw the gas station sign, I almost felt relieved. It was one of those small, out-of-the-way places, just a few pumps in a little building with flickering lights, but it was the only thing around for miles. I pulled in, parked next to one of the pumps, and went inside to pay. The place was empty except for the guy behind the counter, a younger guy who barely looked up from his phone when I walked in. I told him I needed to fill up and asked if they had a restroom. He nodded toward the back and muttered something about a key. There wasn't anyone else in the store, so I grabbed the key hanging on the hook by the counter and headed to the restroom. The door was one of those heavy, industrial ones, with peeling paint and a rusty lock. Inside, the place was as bad as you'd expect: dirty tiles, a flickering light, and a smell that made me want to hold my breath. But I didn't have a choice. I had to go. I was quick, trying to touch as little as possible. When I finished, I washed my hands and dried them on my jeans because the paper towel dispenser was empty. Then I went to leave. The door wouldn't open. At first, I thought maybe the lock was jammed. I tried turning the handle again, harder this time, but it didn't budge. I checked the lock itself, twisting it back and forth, but it was already unlocked. That's when I realized the problem wasn't the lock. The door was being held shut from the outside. I knocked, then banged on the door. Hello? Hey? The door stuck. My voice echoed in the tiny space, but there was no answer. I waited, listening. I thought maybe the guy at the counter would come check, but it was dead silent. I banged again, harder this time, and yelled, "Can someone open the door?" Nothing. My heart started to race. I tried to think logically. Maybe the door was heavy, and it got stuck somehow. Maybe the guy at the counter didn't hear me. But then I remembered how quiet it was in the store while I walked in. He had to have heard me. I pulled out my phone to call the gas station, but there was no signal. Just a spinning wheel where the bar should have been. I tried moving around the tiny room, holding the phone up, but it didn't make a difference. I was completely cut off. Panic started creeping in, but I told myself to stay calm. I knocked again, softer this time, hoping someone passing by might hear me. Hello? Can someone let me out? The door stuck. My voice sounded shaky now, and hearing it like that made the panic worse. I pressed my ear to the door, trying to hear anything on the other side. At first, there was nothing but the faint hum of fluorescent lights. Then I heard something, a shuffling sound, like footsteps. Relief flooded me. Hey! I'm stuck in here. Can you open the door? The footsteps stopped. I waited, expecting to hear the scrape of the lock or the door handle turning, but nothing happened. Hello? I called again. The silence felt heavier now, pressing against me. Then the footsteps started again, slower this time, moving away from the door. Wait. Don't leave. I yelled, banging on the door again. But whoever it was, they were gone. I felt trapped in every sense of the word. The tiny bathroom felt smaller with each passing second, and the silence outside made it worse. I tried to think of a way out. The window was too high and too small to climb through, and the walls were solid concrete. There was no way out except the door. I don't know how long I waited, but eventually, I heard something again. A faint creak, like the sound of a door opening. My heart leapt. Maybe the guy from the counter had finally realized what happened. I pressed my ear to the door again, straining to hear. Hello? I called, but my voice sounded weak now. The footsteps were back, heavier this time, and getting closer. They stopped just outside the door. My breath caught in my throat. Is someone there? For a long moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, so quiet I almost didn't hear it, there was a soft tap on the other side of the door. Just one, deliberate knock. I stumbled back, my chest tight and my pulse racing. Who's there? I tried to sound firm, but my voice cracked. Let me out. No response. The knock didn't come again. I stared at the door, my mind racing. Whoever was out there wasn't trying to help me. They were toying with me. I fumbled with my phone again, praying for a signal, but it was useless. The spinning wheel taunted me, and I felt the weight of the situation pressing down. I was trapped, completely at the mercy of whoever was on the other side. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at the door. It felt like hours, though it was probably only a few minutes. Then, just when I thought they might have left, the doorknob turned. It moved slowly, the sound of metal against metal sending a chill through me. I held my breath, frozen in place. The door opened just a crack, enough for me to see a sliver of the dimly lit hallway beyond. Who are you? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The door didn't open any further, but it didn't close either. I couldn't see anyone on the other side, just the empty space beyond the crack. My heart was pounding so hard it hurt. Then, suddenly, the door slammed shut. The sound was deafening in the small space, and I stumbled back, hitting the sink. My hands were shaky, and I felt tears sting my eyes. I didn't understand what was happening, but I knew I couldn't stay in there. I don't know where I found the strength, but I ran to the door and pounded on it with everything I had. "Let me out!" I screamed over and over again. "Let me out!" And then, as suddenly as it started, the door opened. It didn't creak this time. It just swung open, revealing the empty hallway beyond. There was no one there. I didn't think. I just ran. I didn't even stop to look at the counter as I bolted out of the gas station and into my car. The pump was still in my tank, the meter frozen mid-fill, but I didn't care. I yanked it out, threw it onto the ground, and sped away. I didn't stop until I was miles down the road, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I still don't know what was out there or what they wanted, but I know one thing: I'll never stop at a gas station that isolated again. The night started like any other. I had been at a friend's birthday party in the city, and it was getting late. I don't drink much, but the idea of dealing with the subway at the hour felt exhausting, so I ordered a rideshare to take me home. I'd done it dozens of times before. It felt normal, safe even, to just pull up the app and let someone else do the driving. The car that pulled up was a black sedan, the kind most drivers seem to have. The license plate matched, and the driver, a middle-aged man with thinning hair and a friendly smile, waved as I approached. I opened the door and slid into the back seat. The interior smelled faintly of air freshener, something pine-scented, and the radio was playing quietly, some soft jazz I didn't recognize. "Hi, are you Emma?" he asked, glancing at me through the rearview mirror. "Yeah, that's me," I replied. "Great. Heading to Maplewood Lane?" "Yes, thanks." He nodded, and we pulled away from the curb. For the first few minutes, everything seemed fine. I scrolled through my phone, responding to a few texts and checking the news. The streets were quiet, the kind of calm you only get in the city late at night. But then, I noticed something strange. We weren't heading toward the main road I expected. Instead, he took a turn onto a side street I didn't recognize. At first, I thought maybe it was just a shortcut. Drivers do that sometimes to avoid traffic or get around construction. "Is this a faster way?" I asked. He didn't answer immediately, just gave a fake, "Yeah, something like that." His tone was casual, but there was something about it that felt off. I glanced at my phone, opening the rideshare app to check the route. That's when I noticed the tracker wasn't working. The map, which normally shows the car's movement in real time, was frozen. It showed us still sitting at the pickup spot. "Hey, I think there's something wrong with the app," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. He glanced at me in the mirror again, his smile tight. "Yeah, that happens sometimes. Don't worry about it. I know where I'm going." My stomach tightened. Something about the way he said it felt too casual, too dismissive. I watched the streets more closely now, trying to figure out where we were. The buildings were unfamiliar, and the further we went, the fewer streetlights there were. I think you missed a turn," I said, my voice a little firmer this time. "Nah, this is better," he said. "Trust me." I didn't. My heart was starting to race now, and I could feel my palms sweating. I opened the app again, trying to re-enter the destination, but it wouldn't update. The car's motion wasn't showing at all. It was as if we weren't moving. "Can you please just follow the directions in the app?" I asked, trying to sound calm but assertive. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he asked, "So, you live alone out there, or you got roommates?" The question hit me like a punch to the gut. It was so casual, but the implications made my skin crawl. I didn't answer. I couldn't. My mind was racing, trying to figure out what to do. He glanced at me again in the mirror. "Quiet tight, huh? That's okay. I get it." I forced myself to speak. "I think I'll get out here. I'll just walk the rest of the way." He laughed, a short, sharp sound. "Out here? There's nothing around. It's not safe to walk at night, you know." The street we were on was empty, lined with warehouses and the occasional parked car. No houses, no stores, no people. He slowed the car slightly, almost as if to tease me, before speeding up again. I reached for my phone and called the emergency number listed in the app. Nothing. The call didn't connect. It was like my phone wasn't working at all. I tried calling 911 next, and thankfully, it started ringing. The driver noticed. "Who you calling?" he asked, his tone sharper now. I didn't answer, just stared at the screen, willing someone to pick up. The ringing seemed to go on forever, and I felt the panic rising in my chest. Finally, a dispatcher answered. 911, what's your emergency?" "I'm in a rideshare, and the driver isn't taking me where I need to go," I said quickly, trying to keep my voice steady. "I don't know where I am, and the app isn't tracking a ride." The driver's eyes flicked to the mirror, and his smile was gone now. "Who are you talking to?" he asked, his voice tight and angry. I ignored him and kept talking to the dispatcher, describing the car, the driver, anything I could think of. The dispatcher told me to stay on the line and that they were sending help. The driver's knuckles were white on the steering wheel now. "You're making a big deal out of nothing," he said, his voice low but tense. I was just trying to make conversation. "I want to get out," I said firmly. "Let me out of the car." He didn't answer. Instead, he sped up, taking another turn onto an even darker street. My heart was pounding, and I could barely breathe. I reached for the door handle, but the child locks were on. I was trapped. The dispatcher was still on the line, trying to keep me calm, but I couldn't focus on their words. All I could think about was getting out. Then, as we rounded a corner, I saw headlights ahead. Another car was coming toward us. Without thinking, I started banging on the window, yelling for help. The other car slowed as it passed, and I saw the driver staring at us. The rideshare driver swore under his breath and slammed on the brakes. "Fine," he said sharply. "Get out." I didn't wait for him to change his mind. As soon as he unlocked the door, I threw it open and jumped out. I stumbled onto the pavement, my knees scraping against the rough ground, but I didn't tear. I ran toward the other car, waving my arms. The driver of the other car rolled down their window, and I breathlessly explained what had happened. They let me into their car and drove me straight to the nearest police station. The rideshare driver was caught a few hours later. Turns out, he wasn't even an official driver. He'd stolen someone else's account and had a history of similar incidents. I was lucky to get out when I did. It's been months since that night, and I still can't bring myself to use a rideshare app again. I keep thinking about what could have happened if that other car hadn't been there, if I hadn't managed to call for help. I don't think I'll ever forget the way his voice sounded, the way his smile faded when he realized I wasn't going to stay quiet. Why bought my house? I was excited but nervous. It was my first home, and I knew there'd be a lot to learn. The neighborhood seemed nice enough, quiet, mostly older folks, nothing that stood out in a bad way. It felt like a good place to start fresh. I had only been there a few days when my neighbor introduced himself. His name was Dan. He came over while I was trying to figure out how to use the lawnmower that the previous owners had left behind. He was in his late 50s, maybe early 60s, with a weathered face and a permanent smile. He carried a wrench in one hand, as if he had been in the middle of fixing something when he decided to come over. "Looks like you're figuring things out," he said, nodding at the mower. "Those older models can be tricky." I explained that it was my first time owning a house and that I wasn't great with tools. He offered to take a look at the mower, and within a few minutes, he had it running. I was grateful and thanked him more than once. He waved it off, saying he was happy to help. Over the next few weeks, Dan came by every so often. At first, it was always under the pretense of helping with something, tightening a loose faucet, showing me how to patch a small hole in the fence. He seemed like the kind of neighbor you'd be lucky to have. But then he started coming over just to chat. I didn't mind at first. I figured he was lonely or just friendly. But as time went on, his visits became more frequent. I'd hear his voice calling out from the yard while I was inside, or I'd see him standing at the edge of my property, looking over like he was about to walk in. He'd make comments about how quiet my place was or how I hadn't put up curtains yet. One day, I came home from work and found him in my backyard. He wasn't doing anything, just standing there. When I asked what he was doing, he smiled and said he noticed my gutter was sagging and thought he'd check it out for me. I hadn't asked him to, and I didn't even realize it needed fixing. I thanked him but told him I'd take care of it. He didn't seem offended, but there was a pause, a moment where he just stared at me, like he was trying to figure something out. Then he smiled again and said, "No problem." That was when I started feeling uneasy. I didn't want to make a big deal out of it, but I also didn't like the idea of someone coming into my yard without asking. I told myself he was just being helpful, maybe a little too eager. A week later, I woke up to the sound of someone knocking on my door. It was still early, barely light out. When I looked through the peephole, it was Dan. I didn't open the door right away. He was holding something, tools, I think, and when I asked what he needed, he said he noticed my porch light was flickering the night before and thought he'd fix it. I told him I was fine and that I'd handle it later. He stood there for a moment before walking away, but something about the way he moved felt wrong. Like he was annoyed but didn't want to show it. After that, I started locking everything. I had been lazy about it before since it felt like such a safe neighborhood, but now I made sure every window and door was secure before I went to bed. I even put a lock on the gate to my backyard. One night, I was in the living room when I heard a noise outside. It wasn't loud, just a faint scraping sound. I turned off the TV and listened. It was coming from the back door. My heart was pounding as I got up and walked over. When I looked through the small window, I saw the handle move, like someone was trying to open it. I didn't know what to do. I was frozen, just staring at the door. Then I heard a voice, Dan's voice. He called my name, quiet at first, then louder. "I know you're in there. Just wanted to see if you needed help with anything." I didn't answer. I backed away from the door and grabbed my phone, ready to call the police. But then he stopped. The handle stopped moving, and I heard his footsteps walking away. I didn't sleep that night. I kept looking out the windows, half expecting to see him standing there. The next morning, I found a screwdriver lying on my back porch, right near the door. I wanted to confront him, but I was scared. What if he got angry? What if it made things worse? Instead, I started looking into security systems. I bought cameras and installed one on the front porch and another in the backyard. The cameras made me feel a little better, but not completely. I was still on edge, still jumping at every sound. Then, a few nights later, I saw him on the camera feed. He was standing at my back gate, testing the lock.